Chihuahua. It'll drive you nuts.
TikTok, it's time to rock. How's it going, guys? Happy New Year, Jimmy. Happy New Year, Johnny.
Happy New Year, guys.
Yeah. 2024, man, we're here.
Yeah.
What that means. 40th anniversary of 1984.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. What a show we've gotten. But you guys are right. And thank you, John, in particular, for arranging the guests and getting the guests on for us to hang out and share some thoughts and some stories with. It's always a pleasure. You've put your mic. Yeah, you're back with us, Johnny. Good. So I certainly look forward to that. But 40 years ago, Jimmy, you were probably about maybe 1 or 2 years old back 40 years ago.
Well, I was 15 years old, about to turn 16.
Oh, okay. Well, not much younger than me. All right. So you just look like a young fella.
But see, here's the thing, right? Is that's like I have this theory that like in '84, if you're like 11 to about 17, then you loved Van Halen.
Yeah.
Right. Anything past that, then you're kind of like more into Zeppelin or something like, or maybe like Humble Pie or some classic rock shit, right? But if you're in like if you're around like 84, if you're in the 11 to about 17, 18 range, that's a sweet spot, man. And I was, and look at me, I'm a nut 40 years later for this album and for this band, you know.
Johnny, what were you doing 40 years ago?
I was 16. I was a year old. I'm a year older, I guess, than Jimmy. But and I'll stretch it out from 11 to I'll go into the early 20s, 23, 24, okay. Because I think guys like Chris Gill, and he was an original guy and a 78 guy, So, and he's only about 4 years older than me, so. I know.
My point though is that like Chris, that kind of goes with what I'm saying. Like Chris Gill in '78 must have been like 14, and loved Van Halen. Otherwise, if he was older, if he was 20 in '78, he probably would have been exposed more to like classic rock stuff.
Oh yeah.
Do you know one thing? Chris is always going to say this. I've always been cool.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No question there. No question there.
Speaking of Chris Gill and our other special guest, John, do you want to introduce them? Should we we'll get these guys into the chat and we'll get them talking. What do you reckon?
Yeah, let's do it. So these guys, everybody knows them. They're huge guys in the Eddie Van Halen and Van Halen community, both, and their work. Some of their work right here. We have Chris Gill and we have Greg Renoff here, and I highly recommend if these are on my nightstand. I just grabbed these two because they're still there because I refer to them all the time. I flip through them, and they're just great books. And these guys are great fans, promoting and protecting the legacy of Van Halen and Eddie Van Halen. Let's welcome Chris Gill and Greg Renoff to the program. It's a special, special occasion.
Very cool.
Hold that up, Greg. I'm gonna present you, please, if that's okay.
Yeah, man.
Wow.
I need one of those. That is my favorite.
Welcome, guys. Welcome to our show. Welcome to the stream. And Johnny, top marks, and thank you, brother, for organising to get these giants in our community on our show to talk about this great album, brother. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it warranted bringing these heavyweights out here with us tonight. the 40th anniversary of this masterpiece. I always call it Ed's masterpiece. A lot of people say Fair Warning or even the first album, but I think if you'd asked him if he were here, he would probably say that this is probably his masterpiece. As I always say, it's got a little bit of everything on it. It's got the mainstream pop. It's got the cream type jams, the crazy jazzy solo breaks, and a lot of this stuff, just like out there stuff. And it's got something for everybody on this album. And I think, obviously they broke through into the public conscious with this record, and everybody's grandmother even knew who Van Halen was at that point. So it was just like, it's like a different level, I think, than, when bands have just their core fans. But when you break over into like the mainstream type of arena, I think it's a whole different ball game. And a lot of bands never do that. But Van Halen did it, and they managed to survive it, because I think most bands, they can't hang on to it. And like Sting said with the Police in Synchronicity, he said they were at the top of the parabola right there, and after that, it was just diminishing returns from that point on. It would be. So he said, well, let's pull the plug now and we'll go out on top. And they did that, but Van Halen chose not to. But they still, for the next 10, 15 years, they remained A-list big time band. So but 1984 was definitely a monumental period for the band, if not the most monumental period for the band. I think it built up to that, and tonight we just want to talk about that, how it built up to it, and everybody's recollections of that era. And we're going to touch on the creation of this masterpiece too.
Cool. Yeah, I gotta say that it just having experienced it, I was 21 when this album came out, so I think that was a key age to be, because I was legal. So I mean, even though I still managed before that, but Van Halen, when the first album came out, I was the ripe young age of 15, and man, that could not have been a better time to have a band like Van Halen making the soundtrack to my life, because and living in Southern California and surfing and girls and cars and Van Halen and Lowenbrow Dark, man, it was just I don't look at any other generation and envy them whatsoever, either before me or after me, because I just think Van Halen was the soundtrack to many great experiences in my life. So I'll just leave it at that. But this album, boy, there was an ebb and flow to what was going on with them, and they were progressively getting bigger. But I kind of saw like a shift. There's a big shift in the 80s in general as far as music fans were. And I think, Jimmy, you were kind of touching upon it, because I was not entirely old school, but I did come up with the heavy guitar rock type of stuff. I was kind of like wedged in the middle of that. So you had the Humble Pie, you had Frampton Comes Alive, but you also had this, bubbling under was the new wave of heavy metal, British heavy metal happening.
Sure.
And everything like that. So to be sandwiched in between that was kind of a cool thing. It was just a guitar heavy era. That's why I played guitar and 8 hours a day and everything. And wanted to be in a band and you name it. And Eddie kind of came along and kind of dashed my hopes a bit, because it's like, gosh, the bar just got raised that much higher. Like I could play Frampton licks. I could play the blues rock. I could play Zeppelin. I could play Clapton stuff, but then Van Halen came along and it's like, no, geez, man, I'm going to have to play 12, 16 hours a day now, to get up there. But, I think there was definitely a shift in the audience. I saw, because I went to every tour. I've mentioned this, a billion times, but I had seen every tour that Van Halen did from day one. Didn't see any of the club days because I was too young. So that's the one drag that I missed out on. But I was aware of them, at least, through the radio, the pre-release and what have you. But there was a shift in the audience, and it did get progressively younger as time went on and brought some new elements in. But 84 was just a big, crossover breakthrough. Everybody was into them all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. It really was. It was Ed's masterpiece. And he did agree. He did acknowledge it as being like his, ne plus ultra, effort that he did. The timing was just right. The band was, going through problems, but still firing on all cylinders. And unfortunately, it's its hugeness kind of led to what happened afterwards too. I think everybody's, not everybody, but Ed's ego got bigger, Dave's ego got bigger too, and that led to more friction that was already bubbling under. And it came to the point where we know what happened with Dave, whether he got fired or left. But there was just, push came to shove, and all of a sudden there was just, they wanted to go in different directions. But at least before they did that, they sure put out one hell of a record. So I'll hand it over to Greg, man. Greg, what's your summary of that era of the album?
So, yeah, so my entry point to Van Halen was 1984. I would say, like, I'm 99% sure I heard Pretty Woman on the radio, but I was entered high school in 1983, so I'm 83 to 87 guy. And, MTV was kind of the coinciding thing for me to see Jump, like, I'd say like a very, very large percentage of Van Halen's fans who, of my age group of mid 50s. And, you see Jump and it just immediately sparked something in me. I remember that, for whatever reason, I went to the mall with my mom and my dad, and I bought I wanted to hear Jump. So I probably walked into like Sam Goody or whatever it was and bought the 45. I saw the 45 and bought it, and I brought it home. And I remember listening to Jump, going around on the record player and waiting for it to be played on MTV. But I also remember flipping it over and hearing House of Pain. And that really, for me, was the thing that actually more blew my, I had heard Jump like 30 times or 50 times or whatever, 100 times at that point. But when I heard House of Pain, I was like, oh, man, that really inspired something in me. I don't know how to really explain it. I started playing guitar probably sometime around the time I heard Van Halen, maybe a little bit before. There was an acoustic guitar in the house. I used to hack around on it, but immediately I was like out to get guitar magazines, and it just became this thing for me, that I wanted to dive into, and reading Guitar for the Practicing Musician, every single issue, subscribing to John Styx interviews, the Steve Rosen interviews, and Guitar World. I mean, this became like the thing I would read till they literally fell apart. I have issues. I bought new ones on eBay, and I have some PDFs, but I have issues that have literally, I could hold them up and show they're broken apart from you reading them so many times. And that was, for me, was the entry into this obsession with this band. I was fortunate enough to see Van Halen 1984 tour. I saw them in New Jersey on April 2nd, 1984. And, one of the things I remember most vividly, I have very, very vivid memories of that. I don't have like I wish I had a photographic memory, but more than most concerts I saw at that time, I can remember most of it. Now I was sober. That might've been part of what I remembered most of it, but, that later changed sometimes. But, I just remember the hugeness of the guitar sound. I remember most powerfully, beyond hearing Ed's guitar and how incredible that sounded, I remember Roth's ability to control the arena. And, I had not seen a lot of concerts at that point. I had seen, I actually saw the Go-Go's with my sister at Madison Square Garden, which in retrospect was an amazing experience to see them. It was 1982. But the ability of Roth to stand at the front of the arena and just stand out on the ego ramp and say things, and the whole crowd roar, point, the whole crowd would roar. That really captured my imagination too. It's one of those things you remember, like, oh, he's cursing like a lot. Like, you can curse in a place like this. Like, I've been to hockey games before, football games. No one ever got on the PA system and cursed. And that just set me down that road. And in terms of thinking about the album, I think Ed's would be the person that we should just look to as the authority on it. He always said it was his masterpiece. And I think, beyond whatever flaws he may have seen in it, I never really heard him highlight flaws in it the way he did other albums. Like he would go, kind of could go through and talk about Van Halen 2. Well, the mix wasn't the way I wanted, or the drum sound, and Alex and I didn't like the drum sound on Van Halen 1. It was definitely an album that had a long genesis over the course of 6 months. Being long, it was a very long process, much longer than most Van Halen albums took to make. And but Don and Ed, particularly, as we all know, fought to make the album sound and be what they wanted. Maybe to the detriment of some of the relationships, some of the other people are in the orbit of the band and in the band. But that's what they did, and obviously history has shown that they were right in their vision. We all look at it as a landmark album, not just for Van Halen. I mean, a landmark rock album in the 80s and in rock history, for a whole number of reasons which we can get into. But it's the other thing I would say is that to Chris and everybody is that, you know, Van Halen really, there are other bands we could point to, but really built out of the 80s, like Chris saying, the audience getting younger. I mean, that in some ways is a good, you know, a good healthy sign. If your audience is aging, that's not usually a good sign for a band. I feel certain that Black Sabbath's audience aged. I love Black Sabbath as much as anybody here, but I feel certain by like 84, 85, 86, they weren't having 13-year-old girls, 14-year-old girls being like, I really got to go see these guys. This is the hot new thing to see.
Yep.
Whereas by 1984 with Van Halen, that was definitely happening.
Yeah, you know what? The funny thing is, it's like, you know, they were like the ultimate, even though half the guys weren't from America, they were the ultimate American. They were, you know, with the world viewed as America in the 80s. You know, I just remember growing up in that time here. It just seemed like a great time because obviously we were teenagers. We didn't have a care in the world. It was just like the 80s were, you know, full of excess everywhere. Everything was just, you know, and I think they were like the poster boys for, you know, rock and roll music, American rock and roll music during that time. And it's funny because, you know, you're talking about the making of the album with Don and Ed always, and Chris, your interview with Ed and for the 30th, was it the 30th anniversary already?
30th anniversary. Yeah.
I can't believe it's that long already. That
I know.
Yeah, it's crazy. But, you know, he pointed out, it was just amazing. Like, you know, when athletes are in the zone, like there's a certain point of their career where it's like anything they do, they're just incredible. They were in like a zone, like a, you know, rarefied air during the making of that album. Everything from the cover of the album, which couldn't have been any better. I mean, it's still one of the greatest album covers of all time. They could do no wrong with that. And it's funny because he mentioned to you, Ed, that even that the Simmons drums, which generally sound very dated, even on the next album, 5150, they do sound dated, the Simmons drums, but he used only Alex, you know, he didn't poison the album with them on 1984, and it still sounded organic. And Ed pointed out to you, even all those years later, that they still sounded, for what they were, they sounded pretty amazing. And considering that at that point the studio didn't have a drum room, it was just that main room, and Ed's cabinet were in there, we're in the same room with the, you know, with the gobos or whatever, just kind of sectioning it off. It's pretty amazing that the sound that they got on that album, you know, I think when I compare that to 5150, I just think 1984 just breathes a lot more. It just sounds a lot better than 5150 does. 5150 seems more dense to me. Obviously the guitar had a lot more stuff on it. In 1984, it was so clean, the sound of the guitar, clean and sustained. And I just, to me, it's my favorite Eddie sound on any album. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't like the first album. It wasn't even like Fair Warning. It was incredibly clean sounding and sustain, you know, tons of sustain. And I'm sure he generated a lot of that sustain with his fingers because he played his fingers so hard on the fingerboard to squeeze the sustain out of it. But it just, I just, like I said, I just think everything just on that album just fell into place, and they could do no wrong. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the one thing that stands out to me a lot is the fact that, you know, 5150 wasn't quite a state-of-the-art studio. You know, it was a professional studio, but they had a 16-track 3M machine, you know, and, you know, you got to remember a couple of years before that. And this, of course, this completely negates what Lukather tried to claim about doing the solo at 5150, which didn't even exist when the Beat It solo was recorded. But they had two 24-track machines running in sync. You know, and here's Van Halen putting out, you know, an album that sounds every bit as good as that mega Quincy Jones, Bruce Swedien production, you know, done, you know, in a ersatz racquetball court, you know, with a 16-track machine, you know, they've got some good processors in there and everything, you know, but it's kind of primitive. But I think that's kind of the charm of it too. But it's just it sounds really effing good, you know. And
Don had,
you know, that old United Western board, you know, that Ed just thought was a relic, you know, and everything. But that board, it did its magic. It worked, you know. It sounded good, and they really delivered. I'm sure Ted. I don't know if you talked with Ted, Greg, about this. Was he a little bit worried when he saw 5150 for the first time?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, he was very worried. I mean, I think the way Ted kind of laid it out to me was that when 5150 was being built, his idea and I think initially probably was Don and Ed's idea at least, was that it was going to be a demo studio, that there wasn't necessarily when they first like broke ground that we're going to make the next record here. But over time, Don and Ed came to believe that it was the right thing to do. And actually, when the second part of the interview I did with Don comes out in Tape Op magazine, it should be out in the next couple of weeks.
Cool.
We talk about this in there. You know, and so they kind of approached Ted with the idea of like, we're going to make the album here. And Ted said he was willing, but he had reservations. He had been to other home studios and had seen what had happened at home studios, which was there was a lot of stuff that went on that was not going to go on a professional studio, and that a lot of time gets wasted. I think Ted was honest in the book about the fact that he wore two hats, that he was an executive for the record company. Obviously, we know he signed Van Halen and was the person inside Warner Brothers who was really committed to keeping the band on top the best he could from his position. He was obviously a huge fan of the band and was somebody who loved those guys. So, you know, from his stat as a record company executive, he's looking like, we got to get this record out. I want to get it done. Doesn't mean just, you know, won't take time, but he also doesn't want to see where you're sitting around and there's like piles of tape piling up and nothing's getting done. And plus the other thing that Ted indicated to me, which is that he couldn't quite understand from one level of like, you have Sunset Sound, which to him was one of the best sounding studios in the whole planet. And you have it 15 minutes away from your home. Why would we go to somebody's backyard to make a record? But he was willing to go along with it, obviously, and that was the plan that went forward. But you know, kind of, I'll wrap this point and kick it back to Chris. Is that Ted said over and over, and I think it's pretty clear in the book that he knows that if the album had been made at Sunset Sound, it would not have sounded the same, may not have been as successful. It would have been different. And he also understands that a lot of he felt like the chaos and a lot of the things that went wrong with the relationships between him and Ed and some other stuff that went on were probably partially a product, at least, of what was of the environment of 5150. Not solely, but that was part of the issue that kind of made for fractures in the band.
Yeah, I think Ed, you know, when I spoke with Ed 10 years ago, you know, on the record, you know, he still had a little bit of vitriol, you know, towards Ted, which, you know, shows in the interview some stuff that he was kind of butting heads with him. And, you know, really just, you know, he loved to use that, you know, that Frank Zappa, you know, what was it? You know, the ram it up your poop shoot, you know, it's like, you know, it's like, he kind of felt that's what they did, you know, that Ted and Dave did to him with Diver Down. You know, it's kind of push-pull dichotomy thing that happened. You know, it started with Fair Warning of Ed kind of taking the reins and going into the studio after hours and everything. And poor Valerie, newlyweds, you know, and here's Ed off in the studio, you know, till the wee hours of the morning, sometimes not even coming home, you know, and but created this great record, you know, and then Diver Down wasn't even really in the plans. The single did well. You know, and they went back to, let's go in the studio, bang out a record, boom, 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 you know, and Ed wasn't in that mind frame anymore. You know, he had accepted doing overdubs and he accepted the studio as an instrument. Finally, you know, it was less about let's capture the band's live sound and now let me see what I can do in the studio. And I think that's what, you know, just put this spark in him. You know, he mentioned having, you know, a room at his house, you know, where he had a Tascam 4-track machine that he'd work on demos, but that just wasn't doing it, you know, and, you know, but having that, you know, this studio just up the hill from his house, you know, a short stumble up there where he could go and work anytime he wanted, anyhow he wanted, was just, and I think that is the thing. I think he's just, it was like the creative reins were just let loose and Ed just like, okay, I'm going to go for it. No one's going to tell me, you know, what to do, how to do it. And I'm still, you know, I know there's more tracks that were done for it. And we know some of the track names on that. There was that Warner Brothers memo from like August of '83 or whatever. It has a bunch of, and we know some songs were probably renamed, which was the case with a lot of stuff, but some stuff, you know, there's still more names than there are actual tracks that are on the record. Right. And I'm just really curious, you know, I talked with Wolf about this, about the Viette Citron baritone. You know, there's a song called Baritone Slide, which I think maybe Drop Dead Legs, but it probably redone, you know, or is the baritone buried in the background somewhere, but or is it an entirely different song? But, you know, we see that in these photos of 5150 in the early days. We see this Viette headstock, or sometimes the weird shaped, it's kind of like a Gilled Thunderbird body in the background. So, Ed, when he got a new toy, he would use it. We saw that throughout his career.
There it is. Yeah.
That's stuff.
The thing I was going to say, Chris, is that I asked Ted about this, and he didn't really recall, a lot of these early titles, but he thought baritone slide, that he said Ed had a baritone guitar that he was messing around with. I mean, again, I'm just kind of repeating what you're saying, but that he thought that Ed had come up with something on a baritone guitar, and it was a different song, but that's just his recollection. The other thing I was going to say is that, if there's Midnight Hour, which we know was cut, it was definitely cut. It's probably sitting up there on a shelf. From what I gather, that was sort of like, let's appease Dave and maybe Ted. Actually, Ted didn't really have any recollection of it either. He's like, I don't even really remember that we cut that. He said, I don't remember it. So that whatever that was sort of probably just like, okay, here you go, Dave. Now, thanks. You've had your input. Now we're gonna move on to the other stuff, and that never came out. But that's presumably sitting up there, whether it's mixed or not. But they recorded it. So
yeah, and that's the thing we know. I mean, that's I know that the guys try and downplay. Wolf and Al try and downplay, oh, there's not really anything. And it's like, well, Wolf says like, well, he put out what was finished. And it's like, yeah, but we know that, I mean, I know there's stuff for Van Halen 3 there's a completely finished record. It's finished, and no one talks about that. We know that, I know, even for a different kind of truth, that yes, maybe those songs aren't finished, but the only thing that wasn't finished was Dave's vocals. But the three of them worked out the whole musical thing for Dave to do his karaoke too. Basically. So, and with 84, there had to be stuff. And I know, especially because of the time frame involved, and Ed had 5150, so he had to have more stuff out there. It wasn't like going to Sunset Sound where you were kind of under the gun, and on the time clock, and you had to get in and get out of there. So I don't see in the first 5 records there being that much chance of any extra tracks. There may be a few things here and there, but starting with 1984 and onwards, there's got to be a mother load.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say to that really quickly is that, Don Landy, we all know he rolled the tape on Eruption kind of before Ted even thought about it. He was already rolling the tape, and he's an engineer. We can look at the 1984 synthesizer interlude, which is like 50 minutes long. From what I understand, Ed wasn't even being aware that he was being recorded for that. That was just, sort of that, if an engineer is standing in a studio and your musician is out there making music, you're going to record it. You're not going to sit back and like put your feet back and read the paper and be like, oh, you wanted me to tape that? Sorry, I was watching the Dodgers game and like reading the paper. You're going to record it. So there's no doubt whatever the quality is or not, I feel certain there are reels and reels and reels of tape of things from the 1984 era and afterwards. That would be, but again, and as to your very good point, like at Sunset Sound, obviously there's, you're, even if you have a lockout, you're not going to be in there probably 24 hours a day like you would in 5150.
Yeah.
So,
and I think it's, I just want to say real quickly while it's my thing about talking about those 15 minutes, this is the other thing. And I know, I love Kevin Dugan, great guy, and Mikey, love him to death and everything like that. But I really feel like what Kevin said was not fair, and was kind of, Ed wasn't around to respond to it when he says that, oh yeah, well, Mikey's, bass solo was really the impetus for 1984 instrumental. It's like, no, it wasn't, dude. It's like saying I did a whammy bar dive and I deserve credit for Eruption. It's like it's a feature of a synthesizer, that bass swell, that filter swell, the envelope thing. I built synthesizers with my brother from a Paya kit in the mid 70s, and we were doing that stuff already then. So, hey, we wrote 1984.
Tom Sawyer, at the beginning.
Yeah, Tom Sawyer. Well, that's actually, if it's not identical, it's basically the same preset on the Oberheim as Tom Sawyer. So, and he used also the, filter sample hold at the end and various other things. And it was like, really, to me, it's like, it was almost like Ed's synth demo. I worked at Roland and it was like, hey, Ed, you're a product specialist, dude. You're showing off all kinds of cool stuff. Here's some nice string pads, here's these really cool bass swells. Here's the filter sample hold stuff, and then boom, we go into, Jump. But I'd love to hear the 15-minute thing if it's out there. I'm sure it's still available out there. It was edited down to make into, or they picked a segment out that made a perfect intro for that. But I just I'm sorry, Kevin, but Mikey didn't write it. I didn't steal it from him. It's a basic synthesizer sound effect. And you even hear similar on Sunday Afternoon in the Park on a cheap little Electro Harmonics, micro synthesizer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really not much different from that. And I remember seeing Mikey doing that, his bass solo live and everything. And it was a sound effect,
So
that nothing more. It wasn't like because it kind of even downplays that intro because it's kind of nice, it's playing these nice chords and everything like that. And it's dramatic, and it sets a mood. So,
in the same era, the thing I've said a couple of times on Twitter, screaming out into the echo of the wilderness with no one to listen to me, is that I would really love to see down the road a Eddie Van Halen soundtrack release come out. If there are politics around, like, oh, we don't want to go into the tracks from the albums. I mean, there's the wildlife stuff. There is stuff left over for that. For sure, I know for a fact there is. I mean, Don has told me there was stuff that they did a lot of stuff that just didn't, obviously got edited down because of the movie or whatever else, but there were pieces that were longer. Some of it would show up in 5150. I understand that. There's also the material from Seduction of Gina, which I think shows a whole other side of Ed, which I would love to see that, maybe a Record Store Day release or something like that, an EP or something like that. That'd be wonderful. I mean, that's, if we want to celebrate Ed's legacy and not maybe I would have trouble believing that would somehow violate Ed's wishes to sort of put out stuff that he had put out for these movies that, again, are not accessible, right? We're listening to like, dubs from videotapes from 50 years ago, these movies, and to like, let hear this stuff. It'd be great to hear it like, fully mixed and in great sound and stuff like that from those projects.
100%.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree. And that's the thing, is that it's very typical of film soundtrack work. I know from talking with Jeff Beck about stuff he did, that so much stuff ends up on the cutting room floor. You do this stuff and then they decide they want, 10 seconds or something.
Right. Or a whole scene of a movie gets cut and then the sound is not used. Exactly.
So, and we know that it has to be the case, with, the wildlife, it's like, you just, even when you watch the film, there's stuff that wasn't on the record, and so on and so forth. And there's so much they could do with that. And it's a drag, it's sitting there, and
and the other thing that's interesting too, if you listen to, I'm fairly certain if you listen to the wildlife movie and you compare it to the Ripley outtake that's been released by Van Halen store and is sort of out there, Ed is playing bass on the movie version because you can hear all these very aggressive bass fills that doesn't really sound like Mike to me. I know Mike played, it was a live, when they cut the Ripley, it was live Mike, Al, and Ed, they cut it live. But there is Ed, if you listen, there's either bass overdubs or Ed redid the bass for when it was done for the movie. You can hear it very distinctly. So that would be kind of another cool thing to think about, like what Ed's bass playing, Ed. I'm not talking about like playing on, what songs did he play on. I'm just saying that Ed played a lot of bass at 50 and 50.
Donut City is a perfect example that has to be Ed, throughout, just by himself, because it's his style, it's him. But it's like, even, Back to the Future, the little guitar solo thing that he did, that would be another cool thing to put out. There's stuff out there. I mean, even if they did like Ed, the early soundtracks, the 80s soundtracks or something like that, and cherry pick the best stuff out of it. There's stuff. I mean, that's what kills me. It's like, I love Wolf, I love Al, but man, and I love Ed, and I know how Ed was very particular about what he wanted to put out for public consumption, but at the same time, man, we're not getting any younger, those fans and everything.
And to me too, it really highlights, that's the thing I love about the soundtrack material, is that it just highlights a whole different side of him musically, between the keyboards, the bass playing, the drums on stuff. There's this a whole other side of him, the Linn drum machine. That would be just to, I think, open people's minds about his talents as a musician.
I agree. It's funny because I was just watching today in preparation for this. I have a bootleg I picked up, and it's on YouTube, of course. Everything's on YouTube nowadays. But the Montreal performance, 1984 tour, and just thinking what a missed opportunity it was that they didn't do a live album for that tour. Because then, when it comes up to these fucking arguments about who's the greatest guitarist out there, and people say like, oh, Ed, and he was just tapping or whatever. But man, do you get the full on display of what Ed could do, especially when he does his solo segment, and he does the thing with the the guitar tray. Yeah. It's like, that's really on another level. Like, okay, he's a genius. I'm sorry, but he was doing something that was completely different, and he moved on from that even. That's the thing. It's just like, oh, I did it this time, whatever.
Right.
But he was really onto something kind of cool, and it's just like, man, it's like, he was not one dimensional. It wasn't just the tapping thing that he did. There was so much more that Ed did. You know, the same thing goes with the lost follow-up to Van Halen 3. You know, there's a whole other side of Ed out there that people never got to see, you know, and I think that album probably was ahead of its time. Like if it had come out, you know, between 5 years ago and now, that people be much more willing to embrace it because it's a very mature record. You know, it rocks hard in parts, you know, and it rocks hard in the way that Van Halen fans wanted it to do. And Gary fits in, you know, Gary finds his groove, you know, and I think it's just, there's so many lost opportunities with this band, but, you know, thank God we got 1984 at least out of them, you know, because that's like, again, what an epic record. And, you know, the sales speak for themselves on that.
Chris, I was talking to somebody about this a couple of days ago about how lucky we are to even have that Montreal 84 show. It's the only complete show. There's a Vegas one, but that's only like half the show. You know
right.
I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And that was like you know, one of the few times they did 2 encores too. So a lot of times they did, you know, 1 encore. Sometimes they had no encores on that tour, depending on how they were feeling. So it was, you know, one of the longer shows that they did, one of the longer sets. But yeah, it's, you know, and I know Ed kind of talked about it. Oh, it was kind of a Vegas review, and you see the parts. Yeah, everybody had their segment. I mean, it goes right in from the second song, goes into Alex, goes into a drum solo, you know, and then it goes into Mikey has a couple bass solos, you know. Dave goes off in the middle of Everybody Wants Some into this long rap, you know, and everything. And my favorite part, though, out of all that stuff is right after I'll Wait, when Ed does this whacked out synthesizer free jazz kind of thing, and like Dave's up there doing the Jimmy Jr. I'm gonna dance, Dad. Damn it, I'm gonna dance. You know, up there, you know, twirling around and doing all this stuff and everything like that. And it's so bizarre, but it's so wonderful. You know, it's just like only Van Halen could get away with doing something like that, man. It's just like, wow.
Chris, what did you think about the Donington? I'll call it a leak, but you know, there was the hour-long or so footage, 1 camera footage of Donington that came out this past summer.
Oh yeah, no, I love it all. You know, I love the fact that so much of this stuff is coming to light. You know, and it just gives me faith that there's so much more stuff out there, and maybe one of these days some uncovered gem's gonna come out. Of something. I mean, you know, Oakland people have gone back and forth about it. And I totally buy Ed's thing that they were just, I know, because I worked for a record label during those days, the early days of MTV. I worked with Boardwalk Records and Joan Jett and Night Ranger and Richard Dimples Fields and Ringo Starr, you know, and all that stuff. And I remember having a debate at one of our record company meetings, you know, about whether we should pay for Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll video. And Neil Bogart opted not to pay for it because he didn't really see the potential in it. So Joan financed it herself, and it went on and made that record a hit.
100%.
You know?
That's an iconic video. I mean, I can picture the whole thing in my mind.
Yeah, and that was the early days of MTV. And that's, you were talking about the, you know, Hot for Teacher video and the Jump video, you know, and the Panama video. And it's like, man, it was just like that broke bands and made them huge. You know, MTV was just a powerhouse of just communication and getting the word out to the people in ways that radio couldn't touch, because it was this one big mammoth cohesive voice going out to the entire nation. And boy, did they capitalize upon it. And man, Van Halen was smart. I mean, they already kind of started out with Pretty Women, which got banned, you know, in the early days of MTV.
It's a strange video, bro.
It is a strange video, but they kind of got their, got their act together and figured out a way to, you know, cars and girls and you name it, you know.
Yeah.
But man, it's, I kind of forgot where I was going now because we got on this tangent. But
I was just going to say that, you know, that was one of the things that really Ted opened my eyes about, you know, he said, I thought they had it all backwards when they were more worried about the video than they were about the song. And, you know, maybe they they were like ahead of the curve with MTV. They were already like, the video is what, you know, what's important. Of course, you know,
good point.
I think Pretty Woman is definitely a relic of the age. It's maybe not as accessible as like, you know, Jump or something else that they made later.
Yeah.
But, you know, the whole idea of like, we had to go back and we had to cut Intruder to make it wasn't long enough. Like Ted kind of like explained that all to me. And I was like, oh, these guys, he's like, yeah, he said, you know, to him, it was like, you know, it didn't make sense to him, but he, you know, his also take was that the Pretty Woman, the whole notion of the Pretty Woman song kind of won the day for them too. In some ways, he thought, because that was allowed the whole, like the video theme of the reveal at the end, you know, with the Pretty Woman at the end and all that stuff. That's sort of like, you know, he's like, they wanted to cover a song, as he said in the book, I could have picked other songs that I think would have been better of a cover than Pretty Woman, but it fit with what they wanted to do, which they had this whole idea for this, like, this spaghetti Western, rock and roll spaghetti Western or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that was the thing. It was about Oakland. That Oakland '81. I think they only did the 3 songs because it was expensive to bring a film crew out. It's still expensive to bring a film crew out, and film a whole show, with multiple camera angles and everything like that. I mean, it's gotten a little bit more affordable, but it's still expensive to do. And then you have to edit it and all this stuff. And I think the thing was they just wanted to do promotional videos for 3 new songs from Fair Warning, and that was how they did it, so they didn't shoot the entire show. They didn't shoot, 2 days of entire shows or whatever. So that, right. I don't think that footage exists out there, and unlike, audio tape's expensive enough, multi-track audio tape's expensive, but videotape back then especially was even more expensive. So,
okay.
It's just they weren't going to be shooting beef. I mean, maybe they shot some B-roll footage of other songs or whatever, because there's stuff where it seems to be a different segment or whatever, but that's all editing. I mean, you watch Stop Making Sense and they, clothing changes and stuff in the middle of the song or whatever.
Or even right here, right now, Sammy changes
right.
out three seconds.
Right.
It's unwatchable. Yeah.
I'm going to put this out into the universe as well too, man. That's one of the things that Don has made clear to me is that they brought the Wally Hyder mobile truck to Oakland and Don recorded 24 track of the Oakland show. Doesn't know whatever happened to that tape. Maybe it's at 5150, just sitting there warm and snuggly up there. But there was a multi-track, that was what they used obviously to mix the, the video music, but he recorded the entire show, so.
Great. That's the thing. I believe, it's like those 79 shows, I was at the San Diego show that it's on YouTube. They have the audio of that and it sounds great, and Dave was saying constantly, we're recording. Well, I think they were recording.
They weren't lying that time, at least.
Yeah, that it wasn't just something. I mean, Dave said stuff to hype people up. It's just. Right. I mean, it cracked me up because I'd forgotten all about the, there's some dude squirting water at me. I'm gonna fuck your girlfriend after the show. That's the same thing he said at the US Festival. It's like, dude, Dave, man, you've got the shtick down, you've got the lines. He was saying stuff, in between songs or during songs that I still heard him doing in 2015. So it's like, Dave, I love you, man. He's just, it's a different city, a different audience, but now we've all got the proof,
How is it possible? How is it possible that such a visual band with David Lee Roth, 1984, an expensive tour? I think Ed said they only broke even on that tour. They didn't even make any money on it because they all the lights and the sound that how is it possible that Roth, who was a visual guy, didn't fight and say we have to film this? It's beyond. It's like crazy.
Like I said, I keep hearing that there's professionally shot shows that people just have and they cannot share. I mean, Billy Sheehan has said on record dozens of times that he's got a professionally shot Eat 'Em and Smile. He can't put it out.
Yeah,
it's not his to put out, but he has a copy. Yeah. So I think people, I personally, we talked about this earlier, last year, that I think there's some shows floating around. We just haven't gotten them yet. They haven't been. People are just hoarding them. Anyway.
Well, I think.
Look.
Greg said.
The thing is, they're gonna go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying that you had said before, like, I don't think Ed would frown upon, like you said, a lot of the stuff we've heard already. It's been released, like the Seduction of Gina stuff and things like that. It wouldn't be hurting his legacy or anything like that. He already released this stuff. So why would it hurt, like you said, on a record day or something like that, to put out a vinyl of like all of these instrumental pieces from movies and soundtracks and things like that? I mean, I don't see how
it makes perfect business sense, John, to do that.
Yeah,
I'm more interested in like alternate takes, like that stuff that was released, a couple of months ago from like Van Halen 1. There was some 84 stuff in there, but there's got to be like alternate takes of these songs. And why not release that? We all know we understand those aren't finished songs, but it'd be cool to hear. Anyway.
Yeah.
Chris, did you have any sense about how the song selection went for this? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I just honestly don't know. Like, I think when this box set was announced, I had hopes there was going to be some obscurities. I mean, obviously these are things that are.
Yeah, it's I don't really want to say, to be honest, but
no, that's fine. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
The rarities aren't rarity. I was as bummed as anybody, especially because I know there's
Right,
stuff I know from that era, that's out there.
The box set.
That I was expecting a lot more, especially when I got to the initial thing and they mentioned something. And Andrew, I sent you over, some of the info, and there was like a bonus track. And what did it turn out? It turned out to be a nothing track. I can't remember what it was. It was Beluchitherium, which isn't even, it was on the CD, and that was the era of the CD. Like the vinyl was the rarity at that point.
Mhm.
I didn't even know that Balance came out on vinyl in '95, so everybody that has a copy of Balance, more than likely, 99% of them have the CD. So Beluchitherium, they've already got, it's not a rarity. So I found that really bizarre and off-putting. And it kind of, of course, in this age, we can just reshuffle stuff as we please. And, you can just put Beluchitherium back where it belongs in the Balance thing, on the Balance CD and that set there. But yeah, it was like, there's a couple things I knew of that was like, why don't they do this? And they didn't do that. And I know it's there. At the studio. It's frustrating. It's frustrating as heck. And I love this band, but sometimes they just want to take the mystery a little bit too far. And it's not 1979 anymore. It's the day of,
Celebrating.
Now we know what Julia Roberts had for lunch yesterday, that kind of thing. There's maybe too much information. So even if you're going to put this stuff out, it's not too much. In fact, if anything, it's probably even more mysterious to put out, this stuff, because, I don't know. It frustrates the hell out of me. And again, I keep on coming back to that second Van Halen, 3 album. The follow up to that was Sharon, which I have heard and I know exists, and nobody can say otherwise. There's I know 10 tracks that are done, mixed, ready for mastering, and it's a phenomenal record, and it's a bummer.
With a good producer, with a real producer too, right?
With a couple, I think a couple different producers, but oh gosh, what's the guy? Patrick Leonard. Did a bunch of stuff and did a phenomenal job. And it's like, boy, Alex, you'd want to put this up because the drums sound phenomenal. They are the best sounding Alex Van Halen drums I've ever heard in my life. And it's a drag that it's sitting there collecting dust and hopefully not going into digital deterioration, because it's a great record, and I know Gary wants it out there because it's like all these people who kind of put him down and not fitting in the band. It's like, well, now he fit because he'd gone out and he'd done a tour with the guys, but yeah, going back to '84, it's just like those missing tracks, man. I would love to hear them. They're there. We know they're in the studio. I know Wolfgang, bless his soul, because he's got his own career and he's making his own path in life, and that's his focus. I just do wish that somebody would delegate, out there and let Don, or any number of people out there who, people who care about the band, people who've come up in other generations who are fans, let Elvis Biscuit go in there and dig around, or something. Good. And see what they can find the gems, and, and then present it to Wolf and Al and say like, hey guys, here, I've filtered through all the mess and everything like that, and I found this, and here's what I think would make a great record.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, guys, that I'm going to throw at you, if that's okay, because we don't want to sort of avoid them. But there's one there from Pasadena 78. There for you, Greg. If you can get Don Landy to admit that he and Ted used tape flanges instead of a pedal, that would be great. And also, Alan, our very good friend's asking your 2 opinions on the OU812 mix in the new Van Halen box set.
Okay, so the interview that's going to come out with Don in a couple of weeks, I believe I asked Don that question. I'm almost positive I asked him that question, and he said that it was a pedal. My recollection, again, we'll see what ended up in print. I can't remember. I don't want to misquote him, so I don't. Okay. I'm trying not to. My recollection was that I asked him that question. He said it was almost always pedals. That Ed did almost everything himself. Cool. That Don was not willing to rule out that he never did anything through the board. He did things through the board, but for the most part, on something like that, it would have been with a riff that Ed would have been doing it himself with a pedal. Look, I always think I'm a big fan of Don Landy. I know we all are. I think after 80812 came out, there were some comments that were made by Ed in the press that they were dissatisfied with the mix. You know, I presume that they were all there when it was being mixed, and that Don obviously might have had the final say on how the mix sounded. But to me, the thing that's always interesting is that I don't remember anybody, I'll say this till the day I die, ever saying like in 1988, like the mix on OU812 is problematic. I don't, you know, to me it sounded, we used to listen to it full blast. Like cranked up in dorm rooms at the University of Maryland. Like my University of Maryland friends will tell me that was, you know, tell us that was the great moment in our lives. We used to listen to it. Yeah, it doesn't have as much bass. But you know, if you listen to Injustice for All and some of the bands at the era, it probably was like not that dissimilar from what was being done. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously Ed and Al were the guys who had to be pleased, and if they were displeased with it, then they're displeased with it. They don't like it, or were less than satisfied with it. But to me, it always sounded fine to me. I mean, I don't know. Again, like, do I think like Fair Warning sounds better? Sure. Like objectively speaking, does Van Halen 1 sound better? Sure. But I can think of a number of albums I can point to in my record collection I think sound horrible for a number of reasons, but that would not be one that I would even say is like, to me, problematic. But it is what it is, you know, and that's why we got Foreign Lawful. I mean, that's really why.
I agree.
Fantastic. Alan's asked your opinions on the mixing for OU812. Chris, have you got a opinion on that? Sorry for interrupting you.
Well, not on the mix, but I do want to go back to the flanger thing. I mean, that was very much a part of Ed's, you know, his approach was playing pedals a little bit differently than a lot of people did. You know, that momentary engagement of a flanger pedal as, you know, this accent. You know, he was doing that stuff even on, you know, Ain't Talking About Love. He was doing that as well. He was just engaging it really quickly, you know, and on and off, you know, and, you know, most players back in the day, you know, they would leave it on like Ed would do, you know, with the phaser, the Phase 90, leave it on like for a whole solo or whatever, you know, but Ed really got into using these pedals as an accent. And it was another instrument to him. So I will say that I did ask Ed about, you know, there's kind of this semi-chorusing type of effect on Drop Dead Legs, you know, and Ed wasn't sure about that. And, you know, and he thought Don might have done something there, but yeah, I agree. You know, I mean, Don obviously knows what he did. And I hear what Don did was more in kind of the reverb treatment, you know, maybe some delays, some EQing, that sort of thing. But he wasn't making the big, you know, I'm going to change Ed's tone overall, you know, in this big, you know, way by imposing an effect on it. I've done it as a producer myself with records, and man, have I had bands get pissed off at me. Like, you know, even sometimes putting a delay effect on a vocal on, you know, on the chorus or something like that to make it bigger and dramatic. And they're just like, no, that's not the way we did it. You know, it's like, oh, sorry, dude, it's okay. Off, mute, you know. But yeah, I couldn't see that. I mean, you know, Ed had such a singular sound and he was really on top of it. So anything as dramatic as that flanging effect would have been, you know, and just the timing of it too, man, you'd have to have some pretty damn fancy finger work to do, you know, to do finger, you know, the old school machine flanging, tape machine flanging to get the timing, you know, how it goes up. And then on the other side, you get the drop, you know, and everything like Weasel's talked about, like he could never get that, you know, quite right, you know, and that's just something that you get from a machine, you know, like an MXR flanger, a little more precise. So, but yeah, I can't really say anything about the mix. You know, I really, you know, I'm just going to stay out of that because I mean, tastes change. It's just like anything when things get remastered, and a lot of people are against the hard brick, you know, mastering, which I kind of agree to a certain thing, but it depends on how you listen to music. And a lot of people just listen to music on, you know, crappy systems nowadays, unfortunately. So sometimes the brick level mastering it works better. You know, I listen to some, you know, sometimes I'll be driving in the car and I'll be listening to some classical music, man. And it just sounds like, gosh, you can't hear anything, you know, because it drops down too far. And that's just in a car with a halfway decent system or whatever. So there's arguments on both sides.
Yeah. Real quick, I would say too, is I think in my conversations with Don, he's been pretty consistent about saying that even if he had a chance to remix, he wouldn't want to. I think he's really of the mind that I mixed it, Ed and I mixed it, Ted and I mixed it, something, whatever it is. And that was what we thought sounded best at the time. Yes, maybe in retrospect we could have done differently, but it's sort of like a piece of art. It's like, oh, there's a painting on the wall. It's a masterpiece. I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna like change the blue now because the blues bother me. It's more like we did it at the time. This is the way it sounded. So, I can't speak for Don obviously 100%, but it always sounded to me like even if he had the chance, so that hence the stuff that just came out and the box set was just remastered, right? There was no remixing.
Yeah, no remixing.
Not that anyone offered anyone a chance to do that. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't as if that was even on the table from what I understand. But that I even think if like someone said that, I think he would be very hesitant to say, I want to do that.
I think Don was a purist, more of an audio purist, because even those remasters, they're not bricked, like Chris, you were saying. I still compare them with the original versions, and they don't sound much louder to me than like the original. The mastering, certain frequencies sound clearer, and you can hear things like the hi-hat a little better and all. But I don't think like some of them are just like if you listen to some remasters and like the greatest hits Van Halen stuff, and then you go back to like 5150 or something like that, and it drops off the level is so much lower. But I almost think Don is like old school in that way, that he's a purist, and a lot of people think that it loses all the dynamics by bricking the mastering on there. That the ebbs and the flows in the songs, they ruin them, kind of the quiet moments and things like that. But I always got that vibe about him, maybe because it was from that era or something like that. And I feel like he oversaw this latest remastering, and to me it doesn't blow my speakers out. You know what I mean? I feel like that was him making a statement saying, hey, you know what, this is how it was meant to sound, like this, really, not like everybody else does it, just blowing it up and compressing everything and but I don't know.
And I think that's the thing too, is that when you remaster that way, I mean, not to get into too big of a technical conversation here, but it does leave room for the instruments to breathe. When you brick wall everything, things tend to mush together a bit much. I mean, I hate to say it, but like A Different Kind of Truth kind of suffers a bit from that kind of that modern production thing where everything's just a little bit too compressed and pushed, and whatever, and you don't get that clarity, and that's why that Patrick Leonard stuff is just like, oh my gosh, you can hear every single nuance of what Alex is doing, the stick work, and everything like that. And the toms sound massive and huge, and they reverberate and they bounce and you feel them in your chest, and that's what good master.
I really want it. The more you keep talking about it, it's like I was sold as soon as you mentioned it. Now it's like I'm even more sold. Like it's like I really want to hear it. Wow.
It's to me, it's like like waiting for Brian Wilson to finish Smile.
Yeah. No, I understand. I understand.
Or that kind of thing. That to me, it's like a similar type of thing. There was a book I'm trying to remember that came out in the 90s. It was a book of fiction, but it was about all of these great lost records.
Right.
And I'd have to put that in there now as a modern, a version of that, of the lost Van Halen album.
Yeah.
But
just to clarify one quick, go ahead. Sorry, Chris.
Oh, just with the mastering though, it's just, I think that's what I do like about people take a little bit, less of a heavy-handed approach, at least in terms of brick wall thing, but so you can hear stuff a lot better, so you can hear the individual instruments better. But then again, sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes it's like, you want that smear, because that's kind of makes that magic happen, kind of makes, sometimes it's kind of like taking apart a cake, or something like that. And it's like, okay, you don't want to taste the vanilla and then taste the flour and then taste the butter. You kind of want how they mix together and the bigger part that they come into. So you can go too far with that type of approach too. And some bands work better for that isolation thing, and others work better when it's just like, man, let them go in there and make a big loud noise, and smash everything together into one big Godzilla of a sound, But 1984 is just one of those things that, man, it's just, again, I find it such an achievement because it's like, I still can listen to it and hear stuff, that you just missed. I think they just did such a great job. It really was. I think that the pinnacle of the collaboration between Ed and Don, and just, I think finally it was just like they let loose, and went for it.
I think Don is like the unsung hero of it. Like we were going back to, it was a 16 track. It was probably Don's suggestion. And I'm sure some of it had to do with, because listen, that's enough tracks for what they did pretty much at the time. But I think the audio fidelity had something probably to do with it also. Maybe with, only 16 tracks. And maybe that's why that album still it's incredible how well that album holds up. The sound of it to me, it's like it's one of my favorite sounding Van Halen albums, 1984.
Yeah.
And when you look at the pictures of the studio, it's like 17 by 35, the main room, and I mean, it's just unbelievable how they were able to do that. And my other question to both of you is that album, I believe it mentally did a number on Ed and Don, because I mean, it was like, even I think Valerie was like, it was like insanity. These two guys were in here. It's just like they were losing their minds, I guess, at one point, even with Don with the master tapes. You know what I mean? He didn't want to hand them over, But do you think because they never kind of revisited that, doing another album like that again, Ed and Don, that was one and done as far as that kind of intensity. It seemed like 5150 was more light, just a regular, and OU812, and nothing got as intense as that album. Do you think that burnt them out in a way, like that they didn't want to do that again?
I think the dynamic also changed with Sammy in the band, and Ed had a new pal, with Sammy, and he was, there's really like, it was a bromance going on with those guys initially in the early days, and it was something he didn't have with Dave ever, so I think that changed the dynamic as well. So it wasn't, it was less the Don Ed bromance, and also became the Ed Sammy bromance, kind of thing. And I really can't remember the circumstances how Mick Jones came along to produce, 5150. But I did Ted ever talk about that? I mean, that's kind of probably the kind of thing producers don't really want to talk about, is when they're kind of being squeezed out of the picture. But
oh yeah, we talked about it quite a bit in the to me, and we talked about it in the book. Very quickly, it was that Ted was offered the production, basically Sammy, and Ed Leffler sat Ted down at lunch and was like, okay, all the BS aside, we want you to produce this record. And Ted said, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. And he said that Leffler was extremely angry, and Sammy was kind of shocked, and there was this really bad vibe. And I don't know the whole timeline of how that all ended up happening. I know that reportedly, or I think Steve Rosen's interviews talk about how Ed said that Ted visited and heard a rehearsal, but then he went off and worked with Dave. I would just tell you that Ted sort of wore two hats in the way he described this to me, is that he loved Sammy, wanted to work with Sammy, was the guy who worked with Sammy first on a major label, obviously. But that to him, Van Halen was Van Halen. And he said that he just couldn't, I don't want to say stomach.
Oh, he's dropped his buds.
Yeah,
you back, Greg?
You were saying that, Greg, like, so Ted was, I think Greg, in your book, you said that, I don't know if you can hear me.
Just turn your mic on. Turn your mic on, Greg.
Yeah, you're muted, yeah. Still muted.
Still muted, Greg.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
It's just basically that, he just couldn't, it wasn't something that he wanted to be a part of. And that's not really the right word to say, but he just felt like it would just, and I think part of it, he was just frustrated with the whole making of the record too. I think that probably was the aftermath of that too. And then clearly by like January or February, in the interview that Ed did with Martha Quinn, with Valerie, he's like, we're not working with Ted anymore, which may have been news to Ted at the time. I'm not sure, but that was that. However, it was that Ed was not particularly enthusiastic with working with Ted either.
Yeah, I think I love Ed, but I do I didn't know him then. I just knew him as a fan, but I think he did kind of go through a little megalomania of sorts. I think that he did this record, it became a huge success, and he knew it was mostly him. Then, of course, you had Dave kind of having a similar, I think the MTV stuff really got Dave like into the whole movie star phase
big time
of things, and so he wanted to focus more in that direction and everything. But I guess it was just maybe they just saw it as a time to stir the pot. I mean, it's one of these things that sometimes under the greatest tension, you produce your greatest work, under the greatest stress or whatever, or you could be in a sporting event and your team's like, you're playing, soccer or whatever. I mean, one of my favorite, I support Newcastle United, and I can remember a game against Arsenal, and they were down 0-4 at home, and they came back and scored 4 goals, unthinkable, because especially it was lowly Newcastle at the time, and here they came back and tied the game, tied the match. Just sometimes, under extenuating circumstances, you overproduce, the creative well opens up, and I could see them kind of being burned out and maybe just wanting to change the formula, new singer, new producer. But yeah, you did mention, there it is, the timeline, because it's like, well, yeah, what did come first, the chicken or the egg? Did Dave quit, or did he get fired? Did Ted decide to work with Dave, go on working with Dave and not with Van Halen? Who knows? I mean, it's that's up in the air. We can't go on with what people say. I mean, we have Ed and Ted conflicting about opinions about songs on 1984. So it's it just that's why I always say time and time again, documents and photos, and even now photos can lie, but you got to go by certain other things than just people's memories and recollections. But
Chris and Greg, I've got a question I'd love to ask you guys, please. And I can confirm, guys, that Les Paul Gibson is not Mr. Gooch in the who's joined us. It's not Mr. Gooch.
Okay.
Okay.
That's not the Gooch. No, that's Les Paul Gibson. He's a very good friend of ours.
I wish he was.
If you got, yeah.
He'd have all this video.
Yeah. Early on when we started the stream, both of you guys mentioned something that I found quite interesting, and it's something that musicians and guitar players, a lot of them, have developed over the time. At what stage does an individual or a musician or a guitar player go from doing 2 or 3 albums and just being a musician, just being a player, and then realizing how significant the studio is, and then taking advantage of the studio? What's the catalyst for the artist in doing that? Greg and Chris, I'd love to hear your opinions or your thoughts on that shift that so many musicians have done.
I'll just say really quick that my take from my conversations with Ted and then reading what Ed said in interviews is that regardless of how certain albums might have sounded that may have not have pleased Ed and Al, or vice versa, that they seem to enjoy them making the albums quickly. That seemed to be part of what was in the Van Halen DNA initially. And then, as Chris made clear, by the time you get to Fair Warning, there's a lot more layering of guitars, a lot more time is being spent. Don is, as Chris's book did a great job of showing, Don is beginning to kind of coach Ed on how to mix and do different things, and sort of showing him around a board, kind of getting him on the other side of the glass. But clearly one of the things that happened with the building of 5150 was that it became this other instrument to Ed, where the clock wasn't running. You could be in there all day and all night. You have an engineer who's enthusiastic and wants to record you. And so it changes your relationship with the studio. Yeah.
Agreed. I think that's the thing that, I think Van Halen, many bands, not so much today, but, back in the good old days, when I was a youngster, it was about playing live. It was all about the live performance. And there was this kind of mentality that we need to be able to play this live, or we want the record to sound like the way we sound live. We even have Kiss. Which record was it? Rock and Roll Over, I think, that they did. Actually, I found out it was just like up here and like up a few miles away from me. Nanuet. Yeah, Nanuet. The place is now like some born again church. Yeah. But these bands, like they went to great lengths to duplicate their live sound, and that was the thing. And I think Ed just started to realize that, maybe we don't have to do that. We can play live and still sound good, but we can make a record that stands on its own. It's a mentality I see with Wolfgang. Wolf is that way. Of course, he's a one-man band and everything like that, so he's not really concerned about whether the guys in his band can play or not. They're just going to have to figure it out. But it's refreshing though that to see that Wolf has picked that up from his dad. That the studio is an instrument, and we're here in the studio, and let's do what we need to do, for the record. Let's make it for the record. Mm-hmm. And I think that becomes a point where people realize that there is a a separation. Some people are that way right off from the start. You know, they start off that way, and like they get it. You know, they get in the studio and they can be creative, and that's, you know, I don't have to worry about the limitations of playing live. You know, now I can do this, I can do that. You know, I love like some of the Brian Eno approaches, you know, like Adrian Belew would talk about, where it's, you know, and we see Ed doing a little bit of it, not quite in the same approach, you know, but it's the impossible solo, you know, where it's like, you know, Brian Eno would have Adrian Belew play 3 or 4 different things, you know, different solos, and then Brian would sit there on the faders and bring up different parts of each solo.
Mm-hmm.
And Belew's like, how the hell am I going to play that? You know, it's like I'm playing here, then I got to play up here and then over here, you know, or whatever. And it's like, but yeah, it's a cool thing that, you know, we did get that from Ed, because I think we saw an expansion. I kind of felt personally, as a fan who followed him from the beginning, that, you know, they were starting to get a little tired to me by the time Women and Children first came out. It's a good record. It's a great record. You know, I like it. I just didn't like it as much as the first record and the second record. I just kind of felt like it's just, you know, I felt they were spinning their wheels a little bit. Fair Warning was it was an awakening. You know, it kind of brought back that spark and I saw some progress with the band. You know, and I enjoyed that, you know, and I think that's why Ed kind of felt a little bit like Diver Down was a little bit of a step back, because it was back to the rush in and out, you know, bang out a record really quick. And he says he doesn't think it's a bad record. It just wasn't, you know, it was just something that they kind of, you know, they had the record label breathing down their necks, you know, because Pretty Woman did so well. And all of a sudden they realized, you know, this is an album society at that point in history. You know, people were more about buying albums than singles.
Right. Right.
And they had this single, and they didn't have an album to promote.
Right.
So they had to do that.
Ted always said to me, when I would say, you know, what was the big deal about having to make a record really fast? He's like, nobody makes money off of a single. He's like, there's no money to be made. The record label doesn't make money. The band doesn't really make money. You could sell a lot of singles, but, you know, he's like, the single is a mechanism to sell an album. We need an album. You know, that's what we needed. You know, and I never really, one thing that really never really made sense to me was that why Van Halen management didn't push back, you know, and, you know, Ted always made it sound as if it wasn't his. Ted wasn't the CEO of Warner Brothers at the time. It was either Lenny or Mo Austin. I can't remember, but he made it sound as if it wasn't his decree from on high. We need to make a record. Basically came on from on higher, like from like higher up. It was like, and I never quite understood why management for Van Halen didn't sort of put their foot down and say, you know, I don't know why there was no leverage to be able to say, no, we're not doing that. But that's what ended up they did. Or maybe they eventually at the time they thought, well, it is a good idea. Let's make a record. Let's go on tour. And of course they did. And that tour was successful for them in a very bad economy, by the way. It was terrible. It was in the middle of the recession. It was terrible. They did really well. But yeah, it certainly left a lot of bruised egos and, you know, just, you know, I think in retrospect, I'm a big defender of Diver Down. I really enjoy the record. And I think there's a lot of people just like to bag on it just because they like to bag on it. But I do understand it's a product of the time, and that produces, I mean, let's face it, produces 1984, where Don and Ted both say, we're not just going to push this one out. We're not going to be rushed by anybody into putting this out before we're ready. Hence the sort of, you know, the sense that the album is being delayed and whether that was actually true or not. Don talks about it in the interview that's coming out, but it's interesting, you know, that there's sort of like, there was this sort of, it's taking longer than it should, and just let's get it out. And it was not, you know, it came out on time, I guess, but that it was, in Ted's view, probably should have been done 2 months earlier. You know, that was just, you know, that was Ted's view.
Yeah, I want to get back to that a little bit. So they started recording, we know, in April, really. They started with really Jump, and we know all Drop Dead Legs, I think, were the first two. Like some people claim that on the first night of really recording, those are the versions that are on the record. I think Jump was they wound up using the first take that they did. And I think Drop Dead Legs was one of the earlier takes too. And I think, you know, some people in the chat might even know. I know we talked about it on one of our other shows, but it was pointed at that those two were done either maybe the first night, the basic tracks for them, for those two anyway. And I think they were working on I'll Wait maybe a little bit early on too. But then the US Festival came, and so I think Jump was the only one that was fully completed by by the end of April, I think everything was, not mixed maybe, or maybe it was, I don't know how because you can hear the kick drum sounds different on drum. Tanner and I always talk about it than the rest of the album. So you can tell it was done a little bit differently than the rest of it. But so then the US Festival came and they shut down. And then it seemed like maybe in July or something. I mean, Greg, I know you talked to Ted about all this too. And it picked up, I guess, in July. And then by August 24th, Ted sent that memo out that they had how many songs in the can at that point. So they had 8 songs in the can at that point.
Right. And what does he say at the end where he says like when the album will be done? Because that's to the Warner Brothers. That's like to the Warner Brothers team, right? It's like Noel is CC'd on it and the Warner Brothers team. What does he say it's coming out?
I'm trying to find. Yeah, hold on.
The very bottom. It says something like we should have it done by.
Let's see.
It says we'll mix it, we'll master it, and it'll be done.
You know what? Hold on. Let me see if I can find it.
Here,
let's see. Oh, approved reference stub 1031. Approved liner copy 1031. For albums shipping on January 11th. Approved reference.
Yeah, master October 31st.
Yeah.
That didn't happen.
No. No. So what I'm trying to, I guess, get at here is like by August, they had 8 in the can already, and the album didn't come out until January 9th. So, I mean, and there's only really 8 songs on the album, right? 8 or 9, I think is what's on there. If you consider 1984 a song. So going back.
What were they doing?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Going back to what we were saying earlier.
What were they doing? What were they doing?
The longest song.
It's got to be a lot more stuff. For sure.
I think a lot of it was that Ed was still writing. And I think you read between the lines in the Ted book of what Ted thought was going on as well, that there was some unproductive evenings being spent up there. That just was, look, it's just, they were, I think Ted and Don were locked into something where they had a vision for what they wanted it to be. And they were determined to not cut corners. And I know Don had said to me numerous times that there were things that just weren't right. And we wanted to fix them. And that other people, let's just say for, Ted or whoever else, didn't understand, but they thought we had lost it, so to speak. But we heard something, or we thought there were things that just weren't right, and we were going to make it right. And so, again, I'm kind of reading between the lines here. Maybe Ted and Dave were like, "Let's go, it's done, let's stop. You guys just stop." And they were writing, and they were doing whatever they were doing with the mixes or whatever, and it just continued to go. I know Chris talked to Ed about this extensively in that interview he did, so he could probably speak to this. But that's mine. And then there was the "I'll wait" problem, right? That was the other thing too that Ted understood, that it was important for Ed to be. Ted didn't like the song, but he knew it was an important song for Ed, wanted on the record, but it was not finished, and that Dave could not come up with something workable in terms of a lyric and a melody.
Yeah,
that was the other thing.
I'll wait thinks it's a great story. It's good, and you can just hear it. Now that you know what's going on, that Michael McDonald basically wrote the chorus for it, and I can completely, I can just hear. Because it's the thing, you listen to the verses and it's David Lee Roth, it's like, you're not going to get such good photography from,
Michael McDonald, right?
Michael McDonald, but,
right.
Oh, wait till your love comes down. I'll come and strive for your heart. I can see going into the microphone, and everything, his mustache. Flapping in the breeze, and everything.
That's what we need. We need the Michael McDonald cover of "All Wait." That's what the internet needs. That would be amazing. That would be like that. It'd be like epic.
It would be epic, or get one of these yacht rock bands to do it or something, or whatever.
Yeah.
But in the Michael McDonald version of it. But it's funny because it's just the way it tells it like it was a secret. I don't think it was necessarily a secret. It's just I think they just didn't see the reason to tell Ed that Michael McDonald wrote this. He's trying to say like, oh, they were huddled in Ted and Dave were huddled in the other room with this cassette recorder, playing it and everything. And it doesn't jibe with the David Lee Roth thing either to me of him. I mean, I could see David Lee Roth maybe keeping it a secret, like, oh yeah, Ed, I wrote that. Hey, I wrote that. But I love the story that Ed told about, they're trying to finish the record up and Ted's coming by to pick up the master tapes, and if you got to go to 5150 to understand. I mean, you can see the setup because it's basically, okay, you've got Coldwater Canyon And the house where Ed is, there's like a curve in the road, like you're winding your way up the mountain, and there's the gate going up to Ed's house.
Right.
And there's a road that winds up, the driveway that winds up by the house, and then it takes a dog leg and turns back and goes up the hill to 5150. Then it levels out kind of this this pad kind of on the hillside pad. And then there's a back gate out that just goes the little jog down from there further up Coldwater Canyon. So I can totally see the scenario where it's like Ted's buzzing the gate to get in. And Ed's like, Don, Ted's here. Grab the tapes. Get the fuck out of here. Don taking the tapes and getting into his car, and going out the back way, and Ted pulls up. What's he probably driving? A Mercedes? I don't know. Something sweet. Rolls. He's rolling up in his rolls. It's like,
yeah. I mean, the funny thing is that I think I told I don't think Ted was aware of that, and I told him. Now he wasn't like super bent out of shape when he heard the story. He was just, he was like, those guys. He was like, he was annoyed, but he was just like, but I don't think he knew that was what was that whole the thing. I don't think he had ever read that interview, but from Ted's perspective, he was just. There were some moments where we talked and he was pretty frustrated thinking back on it. He's like, I don't know. He's like, I don't know why it got so weird. I just wanted to talk. I just wanted to talk. Like, I just wanted to talk about what do you guys doing? Like, he's like, I'd always, from his perspective, he's like, whatever disagreements Ed and I had in the past, I always wanted to please Ed. That was really what I wanted, was to make the bands I worked with happy. I always wanted Ed to be happy, Ted said to me that he didn't, he wasn't really aware of like how pissed off Ed was about Dancing in the Streets until after the fact. And it seems like he didn't say it to me. He didn't come up to me and say, I don't want to do this, and so from his perspective, like the kind of craziness that went on was sort of it was difficult for his friendship with Don, for they were very close friends, and of course friends with Ed too, obviously. I mean, like they were friends, and just sort of have it go like that. I think Ted's perspective was like, just wish we could have just found another way to kind of, but it was let's just, in shorthand, it was a crazy time. Let's just just put it that way. It was a crazy moment in their lives, and crazy stuff, and just.
I think this is the time to put up the Rick James quote.
Yeah, I mean, that's the level of paranoia.
Yes.
Ted admits to a lot of mistakes in the book. I mean, I think I really respected him for saying like, I fucked this up, or I didn't do a good enough job for my artist here. This song, and other artists, like I screwed up. Basically not going like, oh, it wasn't me. I just, I'm perfect. I think Ted owned a lot of what, was willing to own a lot of that stuff, but he sort of, I think, felt like he wished there could have been a way to sort of just like these three guys who had worked together first since 1977 to kind of sit down and say, look, what the hell is going on here? Like, why can't we just find whatever common ground there was, or whatever, like, or just to sort of clear the air to be like, I'm not trying to steal the tapes, like whatever, I'm not coming, I just want to get the album out. I'm not kind of coming to steal the tapes in the middle of the night and like put the album out. I just want to make sure we're going to put the album out because I'm not confident it's going to ever come out, Yeah. In fairness, to Ted.
Fairness to Ted. Ed being the younger brother too, and me being the younger kid in the family, that you kind of have this, defiance of authority,
absolutely, kind
of streak in you, because you got to stand your own ground, with to get the food on the table or to whatever, to get noticed or what have you, and I have that streak too, where it's like someone can be looking out for me, but because they're the authority above me, I'm just like, fuck you, Right. So I see that in Ed, that's something a trait I saw in Ed a lot, was just, if somebody came at him, with an authority thing, his first response is to defy them, And
Ted had this great analogy in the book that I thought really was perfect to summarize it. He said, like, when the first few albums, everything I suggested was like, great idea, Ted, like, good idea, like, and like everything worked. The albums were sold, and we, everyone was happy. And he's like, but over time, it's like, it's almost like a teenager he's like developing. And he wasn't saying that to talk down about Ed. He was just basically like, over time, you're just sort of like, who's say, I know some stuff too, buddy, like, you don't know it all. Like, I have ideas, and sort of, that's where that adversarial sort of came into it. And Ted wasn't trying to be disrespectful to Ed or Al or anybody else. He was just saying that sort of, initially they were new, they were green. Ted had platinum records and had been established. And so, they were like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And the sort of the proof was in the records had done well. But over time, obviously you have as an artist, you have a feeling for what you want your records to sound like. And you sort of start to think about things. You're like, I don't want to do this over again like this. Now, then, in retrospect, I don't think that was such a good idea. And so, there's sort of this clash ends up happening where you look, Ed needed to produce his own records. I mean, that's the bottom line, is that Ed was at that point where he was capable of producing his own records. And that's what he did.
You know what? We should kind of mention too, like, at the end of Ed's life, Don and Ted, in the last months or whatever of his life, they were there on the phone with him, and so the respect for each other went all the way to the very end. So they may have been just like, squabbling here and there over things, but I don't think it was anything personal, right? It was just, they each had ideas on how to make the best, music they could possibly make. And I just think it's nice that at the very end, because we know sometimes Ed's relationships with people, didn't end well, and, in certain circumstances. But I think he always had a major respect for Ted. And, it was good to hear that Don and Ted would be on the phone with him when he couldn't speak, and they were making, they were laughing, joking about old times and things like that at the very end. So, yeah,
I mean, for Ted's perspective, and I think probably Don too, that it was just sort of, I'll speak for Ted, is that, Ted sequenced and helps, or at least helped sequence. I shouldn't say sequence. He offered suggestions on the sequences of 5150, OU812. I mean, he was an executive at the company. It wasn't like they'd just be like, it would have been very awkward not to talk, right? So they, for whatever it was worth, they sort of, I think, put it behind them. And then, of course, Ted was invited back to work on the Fuck record with Andy Johns. And so, they called him to come up and help. And so, yeah, and I think all this stuff was just sort of like awkwardness too. It's just sort of over, it's just one of these things you're like, oh yeah, I just had to talk to this person in a while. It wasn't as if like there was any animosity that was any long lasting. I can just tell you for a fact that Ted had a very deep affection for Ed, and, cared about those guys, and was just thrilled with their success. I mean, Ted, we all know the story that Ted talked about, how like when he first met those guys, they were dead broke. And like, he told me himself, he's like, Ed had his car door shut with a guitar string. He's like, literally, he said, that's how poor these guys were, and he said, for those guys to have the level of success and, whatever part I played in it, that was what I wanted for my artists. He's like, Nicolette Larson, Doobie Brothers, Van Halen. He's like, that's what made me the most satisfied, is to have a person who went from obscurity to stardom through working with them on a record.
Guys, I've got a question that I want to throw in there in this conversation, and it's a point that our good friend Keith Campbell has made about Ed recording Beat It. How important was him being in another studio and seeing that process, recording that part on that song, have an influence on the way that he was going to orientate and work back in the studios that he was doing Van Halen stuff in? Is that was that a defining point in that whole perspective, or was it just something that he just went and did and we're reading too much into it maybe?
You take it, Chris. Yeah.
Chris is gone. Greg.
Hey, where'd everybody go? Oh, okay.
Chris.
So, I think, from what I understand, when Don and Ed went over to Westlake, Ed took a few passes on it. It was then comped together, and then the solo was basically approved by Bruce Whedon and Quincy. Thank you, Quincy. So I guess the one thing I would say, it was not going to be this thing where they could. I think Ed did a lot of solos that were, off the cuff, a lot of spontaneous solos. We know that he didn't sit there and like work out. Some of them worked out, some of them weren't. But it certainly wasn't a situation where Ed was going to spend like a week, in the studio. It was like an afternoon that he did there, but they played it a few times, and then they comped it together, multiple takes, and then it was put on the record. Are they really? Andrew, I swear, I'm not wearing my glasses because it reflects off the screen, and so like I'm actually a little bit blurry. So that's what really threw me off, is that I saw you and I saw the beard, and I thought it was still Chris, and I was like, "You take it, Chris," and I was like, "Why isn't Chris saying anything? Like he's right there." And then I was like, "Oh." So anyway, I'll put my glasses back on and I'll just think. So it's like it's,
Chris, where are you?
Yeah. Come back.
Come back. He's in the chat. He's like, "Gotcha."
See you guys later. What's that? That's an Irish goodbye, isn't it?
Yeah, that was an Irish goodbye. An Irish guy too. An Irish guy with an Irish goodbye.
He's like,
I was just thinking about it. So Top Jimmy was like really the only song that they never ever played live, I don't think, right? From 1984. I think that was the only...
I mean, we don't have every recording of every 84 show bootleg, but I think it's highly unlikely that they did it. Yeah. I don't think it was ever.
I don't think they did drop
or
that.
Drop Dead Legs either, too, right?
But they did that in 2015. They did.
Oh,
that.
right. Oh, yeah. I understand what you mean. I meant, yeah.
But the original band, never. I mean, but Top Jimmy's the only one I can really think of, and obviously the instrumental 1984. You know, although I did play that live, with in front of Jump on 1984 tour. So so the only thing from the album that the original band never played was Top Jimmy, Drop Dead Legs, the original with Mike, in the band. And I guess, I mean, they jammed Girl Gone Bad and they played House of Pain in the set. So that was pretty much it then. Everything else was, it really is a short album. Was it 34 minutes long?
Yep.
It's really short.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the first one was 31 minutes. The first album, it was like not that much longer.
Yeah. I know a lot of it was for fidelity reasons, because the more you squash on, that's like, the more you're basically limited, I guess, with how much you could put on there on an album, where before it starts to lose the fidelity. And I guess 30 minutes is the magic number or something like that. But and maybe that's another reason why it sounds so good. But it's just amazing how it does not. I don't think it sounds really dated at all, that album. I just think it's still holds up amazingly well 40 years later. He's back.
Chris, I'm laughing. You missed this whole song and dance I did. I was like, "You take this one, Chris," and you were. I didn't realize you had left, and it was like dead silence. And I was like, "Come on, Chris, come on."
This is the first. I don't know what goes on.
I tuned it up for you perfectly, and it's like dead silence.
This is my curse is that after an hour and a half, or sometimes on StreamYard, it freezes up on me. It's happened the last 3 times I've done these things. That it always the bewitching hour, an hour and a half in. I don't know why it does it. I went through my settings beforehand to think anything I could do to prioritize and whatever, but didn't
the
happen.
question was about Beat It, and about the solo on Beat It, and about your thoughts on whether working at Westlake might have affected Ed's approach to doing the solo. That was the question.
Yeah, I don't think it did really. I think it was a bit of an eye opener, maybe, to go to a different studio and to work on this project. But it was just, wham bam, thank you, ma'am. And I think there's so much lore and mythology around that. And Luke, man, I love you, dude, but sometimes, dude, just shut up. Every time he talks about the subject, he sends it out way down the path onto something else. Ed, there's no way, Ed. I mean, the Sunset Sound thing, when he said that, the round table that he did, I mean, it frustrates me in general, because I had actually contacted the guys at Sunset, and I talked with Luke, and he said that he thought that they had done that. Don and Ed did the Beat It solo at Sunset. So I asked, if they had any records of any studio time logged or whatever, around what date. So I was trying to figure out what date it was and all this other stuff, and if it was indeed done there, because that's what Luke told me. They did it at Sunset Sound.
Yep.
And and I know that Luke also did go there, and they did do the extra tracks because they were busy working on other stuff. I mean, so stuff has come to light. We know now the date was sometime in October, I believe, of '82. So it was very late in the process for that record that Ed did the solo. So there's so much BS around, he had to listen to Mike's, there was only Michael's vocals. It's like, have you seen the log sheet for that? The 24, just the first 24 track, not even the second one. The whole cutting the SEMTI thing up. It's simple. Then you put down another SEMTI track. And all that needs to be synced up is the other one. So you redo those parts. You put that, then you restrip a new SEMTI track on the tape that's been cut, and then you do another tape with SEMTI, stripe it, and then you go back and redo those tracks. But there's already.
I just want to put something out there. I mean, I think Bruce and Quincy were like the pioneers of the SEMTI thing for recording, from what I understand.
Yeah. Well, definitely.
Why would anyone think that they would allow the SEMTI to be cut and the tape to be damaged?
Well, that too, exactly. That's the other thing,
right? It isn't like this is. There was like, we haven't done this before. Let's just let's try this SEMTI thing. And oh shit, we cut the tape. No, I don't think the tape was cut.
Yeah, I don't think the tape was cut either. I think it was just I think somehow Luke in his coke-addled mind. I love the guy. Dude, we've partied together. We've hung out. We've had sushi at the Sushi Nazi in the Valley and everything. I love you, Luke. But dude, get the facts straight, man. Yeah, I don't think the tape was cut. We know that Ed's solo was spliced but it was comped.
Right.
It's what it was. It was a simple comp job, on his solo. So I don't think the tape was actually sliced. It's just we know that Ed did a couple takes. Don probably took the best parts and comped them together. Alan, I actually put my chat back here, but Alan can attest to there's, he has ideas where it goes from one solo to the next because it goes into the impossible solo thing. It's very difficult to play that way, because you have to do this crazy jump. It's like,
it was definitely comped.
Don's a professional, so I don't see him cutting the tape up. And that them doing it in secret or whatever. And I've gone through numerous conversations that Ed's had about it. And it sounded like, that they went to Quincy, like, we have another idea. We don't want to do it over this. Can we do this instead? And they're like, yeah, sure. Go for it. I mean, that was the thing about the arrangement and everything like that. But it's like, these guys were pros, I don't know. It's turned into all this folklore about it. And, just to throw another wrench into the works, I've talked with a few people about this, and I'm doing some research into it. But I think Ed actually did get paid because he's on a union worksheet, a union work order. And it's like, even if Ed didn't see the money, a check was cut, and it probably went into his bank account, or somebody got a check somewhere. Noel got it, or Valerie got it, or somebody got it. But the union sure as hell wasn't let Ed play on a session and not take a penny for it and do it gratis. That just didn't happen.
Right.
And the union never let that happen.
Yeah. Yes. A lot of mythology. The other thing that always comes to mind is that, obviously having Eddie Van Halen playing on a record in 1983 was a big deal for any artist. Off the Wall was a massive record.
Yes.
Okay. It was massive. It wasn't like, Ed's going to do this favor for this unknown act, and suddenly he's going to I've never heard of this act, but I've heard of Eddie Van Halen, so I'm going to buy this record. It's, I'm not saying that to denigrate Ed or anything like that, but it's sort of like it was two very well-established artists, and it was whatever Ed was paid for it. I mean, it wasn't as if Thriller, Thriller would have probably done okay without Eddie Van Halen solo. We would have, would have been different and obviously beat it. We all know that's an iconic solo, but it's. I always thought it was kind of a weird argument to make that people were saying like, "Oh, Ed should have gotten a point for the record." But I was like, for playing a solo, I mean, but people will argue that to me, and I was like, "Well, I don't know. That's how much money that is. A point on a record that you know is going to sell 1 million, 2 million, 5 million copies. That's like a lot of money.
That's a lot of money,
right? I mean, it's just like I don't, look again. I'm not trying to cut anybody down or to denigrate anybody's contribution, but needless to say, it's like he got paid, and I think I'm guessing he probably got paid double or triple scale, and for whatever it's worth, it's great. He did it, and was an afternoon of work, and it changed rock history. But the sort of sense that Ed did it for free, and it was like a crime against, he basically stabbed himself in the heart by doing this solo for free. It's just I don't really quite understand that. I think narrative that's out there.
Greg, I just want to remind you quickly of one thing too about that project, guys. Before Chris, you can jump in. Michael Jackson was a well-established artist here in New Zealand. Van Halen were not, and when Van Halen became known as the guitarist on this great #1 single, "Beat It," that opened the doors to Van Halen from a lot of pop fans. So I think that's a point that you've got to remember as well. Van Halen were not established in New Zealand at all to the degree that Michael Jackson was in '83. Sorry for interrupting, Chris.
No, I just want to say, but I think the story that Ed's told about it, I think was more to appease the band members more than anything. I think it was just like he wanted to make it seem like it wasn't that big of a deal. Ed knew it was a big deal. I mean, come on. First of all, he tries to say, "Oh, it's just Michael Jackson. He didn't think the record was going to be whatever." No, everybody knew that the follow-up, "Off the Wall" was a huge record. It was a big record. I remember it in high school. I remember all the girls and cheerleaders doing dance routines to songs from that, and everything. And it was just, and of course he goes to Westlake, and Westlake's a pretty slick flipping studio. And not only does, they've got not just one room, they've got 2 studios working full time on this record. And of course they're getting towards the final stretch on it. So things were probably a little bit extra manic. And I think we can tell from that Union worksheet now that they were working on Thriller in the other room. It wasn't the ET album like Ed thought, which threw me off the thing, because I know the ET work was done like in June of '82. Like he had that pretty much wrapped up and in the can. I mean, there's a whole crazy story can go into the whole Michael Jackson thing. I don't want to go too deep into that, but it was actually October, which is like they were really racing again. You talk about the race they were to try and get 1984 out. Well, they were doing the same thing, on Thriller, because that album came out in, was it mid-November, I think it was, and here it was a month and a half out, and Ed's laying down his solo, and they still don't have Thriller, the title song, finished yet, so it had to be just a madhouse that he was working in. But I think Ed just basically said, oh, it wasn't that big of a deal,
right,
because the guys found out about it. I mean, Ed told me, and it was just wrong. I mean, I didn't challenge him because I didn't have the album notes in front of me. He said, oh, my name's not even on the record. Well, bullshit. It's on there 4 times. Right. It's in the credits, says guitar solo. The first credit on Beat It is guitar solo by Edward Van Halen.
Yeah.
Don Landy's credited in there. Valerie's credited in the thank yous.
Valerie Van Halen or something, right? Didn't it say that?
Yeah. Ed and Valerie Van Halen, and it even has permission from Warner Brothers. Now, Warner Brothers wasn't going to let Ed do the solo for free either. Right. You have 2 parties, interested parties, Warner Brothers and the Musicians Union. Ed had to get paid. Now, whether he saw the money or not, whether he saw the check, he was off on tour probably when the check came in, so he never saw it, and he just, or whatever.
Right. I guess my point is, like, even if he didn't get paid, the outcome was like worth more than any money they could have paid him.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If they paid him $2 million with no publicity, it still would be not more than the publicity and basically the iconic nature of that solo that has gone on it, to this day. I mean, like, there's no amount of money that could swap for that. I mean, maybe he should have been paid more, but like he probably got triple scale, like I said, or whatever he got paid, and I don't know. It just, I guess I kind of and I think that makes a lot of sense that the other guys in the band, you may have like gone behind their back maybe, and now there's this you want to sort of downplay it, but like the idea that the compensation was you're playing on a Michael Jackson record and you played incredibly well, and now people are putting Eddie Van Halen and Michael Jackson in the same sentence all through 1983 into 1984.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we could safely assume that the Michael Jackson camp, this was well thought out before Quincy called him or whatever like that they wanted to cross over and get the white rock audience buying Michael Jackson's album. And I think they targeted Ed because they knew after Diver Down, it was such a huge success. And obviously they could see where Van Halen was headed with 1984. So I think that's from their part of it, it was kind of like they had meetings or they talked about, hey, let's get this guy here.
That's the one thing I believe from Luke is that it was Ed from the get-go, that they had in mind. Right. It wasn't you, Pete Townsend. I'm sorry what you said after Ed died, but they didn't call you, Pete Townsend, to do a solo on there. No, sorry, Pete. You're another guy I love who's a little delusional sometimes, but love you. But and tell great stories. They're not necessarily true. But yeah, no, I believe that they had him in mind from the get-go. And I think that negotiations were definitely in the works much earlier, because when did Ed do it? He did it he had a couple days off. It was a short break.
October 4th, 1982, I think. October 4th.
A couple days between, breaks on the Hide Your Sheep tour.
Yeah, I saw him October 9th, 5 days later, first time.
Yeah, it was like towards the end of the break that they had, but it wasn't like
Quincy called the top of Warner Brothers. He called Ted and he called Lenny Waronker, the president, and said, "What do you think?" And they both like, "Great idea." Yeah. And Ted was like, "Great idea," right? And they called Ed to do it. Yeah, you should do it. You should do it.
Yeah, and there had to be
because they knew, like they're like, oh yeah, off the wall,
Yeah,
it's like
and the planning that had to go into it. That's why I think it wasn't, because it was so late in the process. Like, what if Ed said no? So I don't see it like Ed tells me, Quincy called me, they came over, played me the demo, I went in the studio and did it. I don't think it was that quick. I think that like maybe back in June, or June before the tour started, that and Ed had some time off. That I think that they approached him about being involved in this. First Quincy calls. Because Ed's told me the story, and it's kind of like the whole story with the Frankenstein, where it's like you think he got the boogie body neck and the body at the same time, but from pictures now we can figure out that one came before the other. because you don't see the neck till later. And I think that's the whole thing with the story, is that Ed tells the story and you think it's all like in this compressed time zone, but it's actually more like this timeline. So I think, it was probably, Ed told me the story of like, we were, there was a break. I think he did say before tour, as I recall. I have to go look and see what exactly he said, but, and he was at home chilling with Valerie and the phone rang, and he said everybody was off on vacation. I remember that specifically. He says, so there wasn't anyone around to tell me no, is what he said. And the phone rings and it's Quincy. And of course he thinks it's a crank call and everything like that. And Quincy has to call like 3 or 4 times before Ed finally realizes it's the real Quincy Jones and asking him to do this. And then he hears a demo. And that's why part of the reason why I think he did it so late in the process. And part of the reason why I think Lucas's stories is partly BS. I think they had to redo the tracks, a couple guitar tracks and a couple things that were on the external, the second 24 track thing that they had to do. But you look at that 24 track sheet, it's floating around out there. You can find like the master tape. And it has, 10 tracks of drums, all these keyboards, bass, all this other stuff, about 4 or 5 guitar tracks, and the solo. And there's one other name and there's a later date and it looks like it might say Dean Parks, but it doesn't quite, the name doesn't really look like Dean. It looks like Dean something or other. But either somebody scribbled Parks and messed it up and spelled it wrong, or it's some other guy. I don't know. But there's no way that, they had to almost rebuild the track from scratch. Like, there wasn't just a vocal on there and then Porcaro had to listen to the headphones and clear a new click track and all that. It's just like, nah.
Do you think Ed had a cassette of it beforehand of any of the music?
He probably did, yeah.
Yeah, he did.
Now,
he and Don heard it. He and Don heard the demo, right? They heard that. Somebody messengered over a tape. I assume, Quincy, and said, here it is. Here's what we have for you.
Yeah.
So he probably noodled around and had some definite ideas of what he was going to do on it.
There's a tape out there. I can't say who has it, but there's a tape out there that sounds like a rehearsal or sound check. And you can hear Dave and you hear Ed play the riff to beat it. And this seems to be sometime in 82. There's Dave makes a comment. It's like a quote of something from the movie Tron. And I'm trying to remember when that came out, but I think that might have been. When was that?
It came out 82.
It's in 82, yeah. So that's why I'm thinking because that was kind of fresh and like Dave was, doing mouthing off in between stuff, and Ed's kind of noodling on guitar, but he plays the beat it riff. It's almost kind of funny that he probably is like, he's probably thinking about the solo he's going to play because we're pretty sure that this was during the 82 tour or either rehearsals or a sound check or something. But it's just funny because he probably was, thinking like, well, what am I going to do for the solo? And he's probably like, oh, it's approaching, so I better work on this,
So basically, this whole thing was not as off the cuff as we've been for the last 40-something years.
I think it was a much bigger deal, and I just think that Ed didn't want to piss off, the other guys in the band and everything, and and I love that, that Dave had heard it, he was out, cruising Santa Monica Boulevard, probably in his Jeep or something like that, and drops into 7-Eleven. I can see the 7-Eleven that he dropped at. I'm pretty sure I know which one it was. It's probably just past La Cienega there in Santa Monica Boulevard. And he pulls in and there's some Latina chicks, some cholos out there, and they're bumping the Michael Jackson, and he hears this solo and he's like, someone's doing a real good job of sounding like my guitar player.
Yeah. Well, didn't he say that solo and Beat It was this? He's been playing that same guitar solo in this band for 10 years or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Rolling Stone. I think he said that, right?
Yeah.
So
The
ultimate irony for me of this whole Beat It thing is that David Lee Roth has never had a #1 record in his life, and Ed could kind of be partially blamed for that, right? Because he did
a #1 album. That is, they had a #1 solo with Jump. #1 solo with Jump.
#1 album, and ironically, Ed kind of by playing on Beat It, which kind of kept 1984 at number 2, right? I don't know when.
That's
when
kind of what they say, but the thing is that album was a juggernaut.
right?
Because you got to remember that album had been out a year, more than a year.
Yeah.
And it was still at number 1 by the time 1984 came out.
Yeah.
I wonder
It's amazing when you look at Beat It, like almost everything was released as a single. There's just a couple of songs there, like, oh, they only didn't put out like 2 songs as singles.
Yeah, exactly. That album was huge.
It sucks because I have this book in the studio with Michael Jackson. It's Bruce Swedian's book, and it's a great book about the whole thing. But there's probably 4 sentences mentioned about Ed and Beat It, and none of them or nothing that we didn't already know. And I was like, well, you'd have thought like there'd be a lot more better detail of what mics and. But
I think they were smart though, because it's like Ed came in with his engineer, he came in with Don, and they banged it out and they were gone. So they really weren't there. They don't really know what was going on, and I think the whole rearrangement thing was really between Ed, Don, and Quincy, basically, and Michael, as well.
Do you think it was Ed's Plexi or was it Andy Brower studio rental amp? Or
I think it was a rental. I think it was a rental. Although I do find it's questionable, because the only thing that's questionable to me is that amp, the Marshall, the number 1, was there, and it's a short drive down to Westlake, and he wasn't taking it on the road. So it was, Ed had all his other amps on the road because they were on tour and they were on the trucks. And that's what Ed said, was why he said he rented an amp, and he told me that, and he told Rosen that he rented an amp. So
Andy Brower, didn't he say he tells a story now too, that then you drive Ed somewhere or
he drove Ed to the session, I think, I think I think he might have remembered it wrong or something. I think Brower might have said something about picking him up at the airport and driving him to it, but we now know from the timeline that was more likely that he picked Ed at the house and drove him there, because that was towards the end of the day that he actually cut it. It was towards the end of the break, so he probably wasn't at the airport unless he likes to hang out at the airport and hunt for change in the or something. But anyways. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that he ran it, but it is a big question. Like, why didn't he bring it? I definitely not the Hartley Thompson amp. That's such a myth out there.
Right.
And that's one we'll never get off of Wikipedia, because the Hartley Thompson guy's son will always go up there and snipe it out of there and claim that it was Halen Holdsworth amp. But Alan wasn't even around.
And Chris, that Hartley Thompson, wasn't that a solid state combo amp too?
It was a solid state amp, yeah. So it was definitely a very technical brittle amp. I just don't see it. I can see Ed, wanting to rent something, and Brower would make perfect sense to rent from Brower,
Right.
I thought the amp that he rented from SIR, I thought it was a Revere modded Marshall, but who knows? I know he modded some amps back then, but I don't think that was the amp he got. But I hear that from time to time.
I think Brower still has the amp. Doesn't Brower say he still has that amp that they used? He claims to, I think.
No. I've seen Jeff Goebel floating around here. He talked with the one guy who's actually, I think that he borrowed it. Actually, it wasn't even Andy's amp. He borrowed it from somebody.
Greg Leon,
exactly. Yeah, Greg Leon. So I wish Greg would find that receipt, though. That's the only thing. It's like, damn, he mentioned having that, and now I can't find it. It's like, documents, dude, we need them,
Yeah, right.
Because that's the stuff, It's like that union worksheet. Oh my God, what a revelation! That's the piece of information that we've been waiting for.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that's, I guess, kind of the unfortunate thing about 1984 in a way, is that we don't know the exact days like we know in a lot of this other stuff, because I don't know what kind of logs they kept on it. I haven't seen the tapes. They may be marked on the tape of what days they actually recorded what songs and everything. We can get a better idea of how things did progress on it.
That goes back to the whole thing, because we all argue and we all think about what guitars Ed played on what song. Like in 2014, when he talked to you, he said he had already retired the Frankenstein by then, and he was using the Kramer 5150 on that album too. But I mean,
but then he told Rosen that he did the exact opposite and said that he was using the Frankenstein. But that was an interview, I think, in 1985. And the only caveat I have with that, well, it's kind of weird, because you would think, because by that point Ed was pretty knees deep in with Kramer, so you think he would have wanted a chance to say like, oh yeah, I played my Kramer 5150 guitar or whatever, and hoping to sell more Kramer guitars. Right. But he said Frankenstein then.
Yeah, he said, I never played a Kramer on any album, I think, in that Rose interview. I never played, and that was 1985. So, I mean, but I mean, listen, we know we have Jim, what's his name? That's doing the 1984. He's trying to duplicate the sound. Gostad, he's gonna have that video coming out, and he says, that he was able to duplicate the sound on Panama fairly easily with his 5150 guitar with the JB pickup in it. So if that means anything, I know Alan doesn't like that to hear that, but but I could see it being on Panama, maybe.
The truth may be a combination of things. It may be that he used the Frankenstein on the earlier tracks, and then he migrated to the 5150 later. I don't know.
I guess the big irony is of it is most of the album was on the Flying V, and then there was just basically the outro solo of Drop Dead Legs, the solo for Top Jimmy. I'll Wait, which Alan thinks that was another Kramer with the single coils in it too. And
House of Pain.
And also in House of Pain. And that was it. That would be the only spots on the record that he could have used the Frankenstein or the 5150 on. Everything else was we know is the V. And even in the Jump solo, Alan is pretty much proven that that's the Flying V on the solo. I mean, I'm pretty sure I don't know if he's still in there, but it was I know you can hear that little pick scrape thing after. I'm sure he showed that to you. That's amazing. Like that he was able to pick that out. So, it's. I'd have to think that the guitar was on there. I always just say that, listen, you get a brand new guitar you like, you never want to put it down. And he got that guitar probably right as they were starting, around that time. We know he had it at the US Festival backstage. So I have to figure it's on there somewhere. It's got to be on that record somewhere.
Use it as much as possible.
And that's the thing. And about Ed, it was like, again, the Viette, we see that in the pictures, we see some of these instruments and the things, and just again, knowing how Ed works, having been around him for, gosh, how many years did I work, talk with him and everything like that and get to see what he did, but again, when he got something new, it inspired him, right. And he used it on something, and then he might abandon it. Sometimes he would come back to things. But usually when he got something new, he put it to use. We see that, Alan and I had a discussion a while back about the MXR flanger. When did Ed get it? And we figured, well, it has to be after they did the demos because there's no flanger on the 78 demos, the 77, demos, but, for the 78 album, there's no flanger on all those initial demos. And then, the songs that they write in between, Ain't Talking About Love, Atomic Punk, flanger is on those, and Ed got the flanger,
Right, makes sense.
So but that's the way Ed worked. He'd get something and he'd find a use for it, and if it came into his sphere, there's a good chance that about the time that it came to his sphere, it appeared on a record. I see that with Ed time and time again. That happened. He got into certain Telecasters for a while, and started doing stuff with them, during the Sammy years. But in the synthesizer thing, it kind of cracks me up because people talk about, it's the synthesizer record. Well, there was synthesizer on the two records before that. There was synth, even if it was a cheap little Electro Harmonics micro synth on Fair Warning, but it was there and prominent, and
so This Is Love, right? So This Is Love, there's even synth on.
Well, that's of course, and that's later, but that's, and then we have, the stuff on Diver Down, obviously, Dancing in the Streets, the Mini Moog, pattern and everything like that. It's like, so it wasn't really like it was an awkward thing. I think the thing with Jump was because that was the era of the polyphonic synth, and that was, it went a little bit from the more of the one note Gary Newman stuff and the ARP string ensemble type of stuff for chords, because that's pretty much all you had. You went to these full blown, big chord, things, and it was just like it was no mistaking it, because Ed previously had kind of used the synth as like another voice of his guitar. In fact, a lot of, he even doubled it up on Dancing in the Streets. He doubled up the guitar with it and everything like that. So it kind of takes, and he did So This Is Love, same thing. Why Can't This Be Love? Sorry, Why Can't This Be Love? So This Is Love. We're talking about the bass line thing. That's another thing.
I actually think there is somebody had the isolated tracks on So This Is Love, right? And there is a keyboard on there too. It's a certain part.
Yeah, it's the bass line. It was doubling the bass line. It's an old producer's trick.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But there, and of course the electric piano on and the Cradle Will Rock. So the keyboards were definitely starting to work their way more and more and more into the Van Halen thing. I love watching Montreal when they go to all weight, and it's just, they become Kraftwerk all of a sudden, It's like Mike's on the one side, up on top of the speaker, the big wall of speakers playing synth bass, and Ed's on the other side, and it's like they're a synth band. It's like, whoa, Van Halen is a synth band. Imagine that. It's 1984. It's the new future. Wow.
I think I remember on Jump, I know we used the OBXA, which was the OBX, and then the OBXA after that. But then I remember him saying that he had problems keeping it in tune, the OBXA.
It drifted.
And he had to send it out to get it fixed. And they sent him the newer model, the OB8, which is basically the exact same keyboard, but it has an arpeggiator in it that he used obviously on Why Can't This Be Love and Feel So Good and Up for Breakfast, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I know he thought, and I have a friend who thinks the same thing, that the OBXA does sound a little bit warmer than the OB8, even though they're pretty much identical. But I mean that of that era, that was it's still, now you go on Reverb. I have an OB8, but they go for like $8 or $10 grand. They're hard to find, and they're still, because people still want them. I guess rap and hip hop people want that fat analog synth for on things.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I watched something on YouTube just preparing for this today. It was like there was a guy who had an OBXA and an OB8, and they had the same presets in both, and he was playing them both. Like he played one, then he played the other, and you go back and forth, and he went through the whole preset bank. And of course, you can hear some of the presets that at least were the beginning of Jump and All Wait, and everything. And you can even hear that the 1984 that thing that we're talking about, the Kevin Dugan story about. That again, that filter thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's it's fascinating though. I think that, Ed just, again, he got, but he was into synths before that. He said he had the Prophet 10 that he wrote Jump on, and it was just a problem. And, he's not bullshitting, because Prophet 10s were notorious for overheating, to the point that they actually, I know that Sequential Circuits was taking them back and retrofitting them into Prophet 5s, because it was just like the circuit was just not working. So, and I think he had said somewhere before that he even wrote the initial chords for Jump on the Wurlitzer that he got, that, he ended up using for in the Cradle Will Rock. But I think when he went to serious work on it was with the Prophet 10. So, but again, those became his new toys. He progressed on. He went from the Mini Moog, that the song that he was working on that became Dancing in the Streets. Then he went full-fledged into it. But he was a keyboard player. He played piano. He was, could play classical tunes.
I think that I'll wait. I almost think that they mic'd up a cabinet, and it was and because it has a very distorted kind of sound. I'll wait, compared to if you listen to the OB8 and try to duplicate that sound, it's not as harsh. And I when I listen to I'll wait, I almost think they had a guitar cabinet mic'd that they were pumping the.
It sounds harsh. Sounds real harsh in the mid range.
Yeah,
it's got a distorted edge to it. It's definitely, I think he's playing it through the Marshall, just kind of doing like what you did with the Wurlitzer. It's the same approach. I'm gonna have to see if, I know that Brad did an interview with him on the keyboards thing. And I know Keyboard Magazine even did a story with him on keyboards. And I'm gonna have to see if he talks about any of that stuff, but probably not. It's one of those things that. Comes from us talking about stuff like this. That's like, if you think about it, it's really this, Well,
he did. Incredible Rock was just going through a keyboard, going through the flange through like a Marshall cabinet. And I was like, I guess you can play keyboards through guitar cabs.
Yeah,
I just didn't have one available. There's probably no really. It's like, hey, we'll just run it to this Marshall cab and it'll work.
I used to do that. I was, in a sense, like I said, my brother and I built them in the 70s, and I bought them along the way. I've got a Moog Source still. I've got a Roland GX3P, which sounds actually very close. Yeah, I can get very close to the Oberheim sounds out of that. I got that in '83, late '83, before then the '84 album came out. It's like, cool, because I could get that many more gigs with bands because I had, I could play Jump, So. It was like the greatest thing for me, but that was, and I always bring this up too, that, I worked for Roland in 1986 on through, 90, 91. And Ed was the only guy that got free gear from us.
Yeah.
Everybody else
he had
had to buy it, but Ed sold synthesizers.
Yeah, the D50, that's when it's love, the Roland D50, right?
The D50.
Clicking part in the intro.
It's so funny because of the D50. I was just, again, I don't want to get off too far off the subject and go too keyboard nerd here, but you know, I was thinking about digital native dance because he used that on Balance, and that's like how many years after the fact did he use that? And it was already overused by that point. You know, it's like it's the one thing that everybody hears, like, oh, look at this cool thing, and you heard it everywhere. You know, it's like if you hear it, you'll know it because it's like it kind of has this weird vocal kind of fading in, and then it goes into this and kind of fades up in the background. It kind of modulates through all these different sounds and everything like that. And it was just like one of the first presets on the D50.
All this conversation, I was going to say that, we never got the deep dive into Ed's. I don't think the Ed's keyboards, like that guitar aficionado, like pulled out all the relics to be like, here's this guitar, here's the Les Paul Jr. It would have been nice, or would be nice to maybe have that sort of like, a tour of Ed's keyboard collection to sort of see what he had and what he used. That'd be really cool.
I agree. And I know a lot of that stuff is still there, I
assume so, right?
Yeah, I counted 6 OB8s over the years. He still had OBXAs and OB8s. Even in when Matt Bruck was in the kitchen and Valerie was doing her cooking show, and in the kitchen you could see there was an OB8 like standing in the corner right next to the desk. That out in there. I was like, man, they're everywhere in that place.
Sounds like my house. I've got amps in every room and guitar cases and whatever, and pedals that you trip over and whatever.
What about Michael Anthony? Do you think he was using like the way miking an SVT, and was he also going direct on that album? What do you think?
I would say he was probably, I would guess. I mean, again, Greg, you would probably have to ask Don that question. He would know. I can only guess, but I just knowing from the techniques of the day was usually to do a combination of actually, do a feed of both, do a feed off the amp and do it direct and, and then blend it as you see fit, what fits the song and everything. So
that would be my initial thought. I mean, Don talks about how even back, the Doobie Brothers, the great bass sounds with the Doobie Brothers, like taken to the streets and all that stuff was almost always amp and direct. He did both. That was what his approach.
I just wonder because they're so limited with space. I mean, you'd think there would be a lot more bleed on the drum, mics with the bass and the guitar in there, and because obviously he was using rototoms, Alex, and and a real snare, and so
I think Mike might have come in later if when he did that, because I think that Ed probably did do some bass on the record on that, just as he saw fit. But I think he did that later. The impression I got from Ed was that him and Alex worked, basically out initial stuff together in the room, and then everything kind of came after that. But initially it was just him and Alex, just working out stuff together on that.
Greg, do you ever think Don will speak more about, in depth about any of the Van Halen stuff? I
think I can't speak for that and what he will ever do. I suspect that he is probably going to say what he's going to say, and it's probably been said. I mean, there's been some interviews he's done with a couple of other interviews along the way. He contributed to the TED book insofar that I talked to him and sort of like, kind of went back and forth between him and Ted, kind of to sort of fill in some gaps that just kind of conversationally, without quoting Don in the book, it was in Ted's voice. And then, the interview that I did with Tape Op, the first part was sort of his pre-Van Halen. The second part will be his post-Van Halen. I also think that Don is a person who is, very much protective of Ed and sort of wants to sort of, I think a lot of stuff that maybe someone else might say he's never going to say. I don't, I can't speak to what another person might say, if that makes sense. But, it's just sort of, I think he looks back at his experience as sort of a life changer for him. And he was amazed to be able to work with an artist of that caliber and sort of, and I also think, he comes from the engineer mindset, which is that, engineers don't talk. I mean, typically, some do. I mean, I know that some engineers are more vocal about their experiences working with artists, but typically the engineer was the guy who captured the takes and didn't even, had limited interaction with the artist, and sort of like the producers doing the talking. Like, Ted talked about in the book, like he worked with other engineers, he'd be like, they'd voice an opinion about something. He'd be like, will you please just shut the fuck up? Like, I'm trying to get this guy's confidence up and you're saying something, and it's like throwing this guy for a loop. I'm working with, other artists. So, that's a long-winded way of saying I think Don is a relatively quiet person. He is a relatively quiet person, and he's probably, I don't know what else he would he would come out to say, but he's certainly not going to kind of come out and do a tell-all like Van Halen. I was like, 50 inside 5150 with Ed and Al or something like that. It's not his thing.
Yeah.
He never would do that.
It's just a shame because it's like some stuff is lost forever. Then, it's like, hey, I don't, like you said, we don't even know if he kept good track sheets of, hey, what guitar Ed played on which song, or we don't even know. Probably not. I wouldn't think they did,
I mean, I suspect that, knowing Don, that a lot of the tape boxes up at 5150 are dated and have notes on it that Don could decipher. I mean, I would imagine it's not quite as precise as was done in like 1978 at Sunset Sound, but when you're trying to, billing somebody and whatever else, there's paperwork that has to be accounted for. But I suspect that it's like, synth thing, June 6th, 1983 Profit or something. I would imagine that would be the type of stuff. And again, I don't know for sure, but I would find it very hard to believe that Don just threw tapes up on a shelf. I think that's impossible to believe that he did that. So, and he's people could hear it and I kind of figure it out, but I would imagine Don would be the one guy who sort of decipher a lot of that stuff. Be like, oh, this is what this was, if he remembers. Right. But, I asked Don all the questions. I mean, that I think that could be asked, it's not a cross-examination, obviously. You just sort of ask and they give you your recollection and are you sure, are you sure it wasn't the Kramer? It's a long time ago, and that's not what he was focused on. He was focused on trying to, record and make a record with Ed. So, his memory, I think, is good, but it's like a lot of people, it's 40 years ago. I don't remember what I did in high school 40 years ago. I just don't. I mean, like, what did you wear? When you went to the prom, like, okay, I can remember that, but like, what did you wear like that other Friday when there was the big fight at school? So I don't remember, right? I mean, it's like, what I'm saying? Like, stuff that's important to us. I think for a lot of, he could just sort of couldn't just sort of fill in the blanks just to fill in the blanks to say it, but he can sort of say probably was this, but he's just not going to recall. That's where people's ears, Alan or the people who hear things like, oh, it's it's this guitar, we can tell because of this. That's probably the best evidence we're going to get, because that just lost the history, unless Alex comes out and certainly, has a different perspective and says something that he might recall about that stuff. Or
Greg, there's an interesting comment here from Jeremy White. Fun fact, Mutt Lang has a journal on every guitar, amp, setting, effect, string gauge, pick gauge, compressors, EQs, all recorded over Shania's Come On Over. And he says, I don't think Don was ever like Mutt. No.
Yeah. I will say that there's different types of engineers, and I think that Don was, from what I can see, that he probably did keep basic tracks and basic ideas, and I've seen even some just the Van Halen stuff later on the walls at 5150, like the balance record notes and stuff like that, and you have your basic log information, and it may be again, just sometimes it may just be whatever guitar or something. If it's a special thing, electric sitar or something like that. Right. Sure. But yeah, like Mutt's one of those examples of a guy who's like, especially if he wants to recreate something, then he's going to take all these notes. One of the most revelatory things I came across a while back was Fleming Rasmussen's notes for Metallica. Master of Puppets and, Injustice for All. He had all those, you want the Metallica sound, man. It's like, you got to see these notes, because he has all the parametric. There's these Aphex, what are they? I can try to remember what the model is, AF2 or something like that, I believe. That they used two of them, one into the other. And then those went into the Mesa Boogies. And I think they went into the effects loop, which I don't have a Mark II C++, but I have a 50 caliber amp with EL84s. And that's a little bit later in that era, but it was supposed to be like even closer to the Metallica sound. I plugged I got those processors and plugged them into my effects loop and dialed up his things. It's like, oh my God, that's the Metallica sound. You're not going to get it out of the amp by itself, but if it hadn't been for that, I would never stumble upon it, because it's actually pretty damn complex, But there's different engineers. They have different styles, and it's great that there are people like Fleming who, I guess because he probably realized that what Metallica was doing, or he probably even helped him get that sound more than they, probably than James and Kirk realized. He's probably like, I've got, because it's such a stretch for those guys. A couple Southern California or Bay Area dudes. They're like, yeah, let's plug these studio processors into our, our amps. I'm sure Fleming is like, I've got these, try these out. These will really fuck up the sound. You can do all this stuff,
Chris, let's not forget also too the dynamic of the band in the studio as well. Ken Collett, in his book where he talks about the making of Fleetwood Mac's Rumours, he talks in great detail about him taking 2 weeks to set up the drums. With the different mics and everything, and he's getting frustrated, and also the band is standing back looking, saying, what's going on, mate? You know, you're supposed to be this young guy, and he couldn't get the sound, and it wasn't until John McVie started playing with Mick Fleetwood that the sound was there.
Yeah. That's the thing, and it's you know, every band has their different ways of working. Engineers all have their way. It's a creative thing. There's somewhat rules, but there's also it's an art, you know. So there's going to be just different things, and especially with 1984, it was kind of like it was a whole new rule book, you know. So they weren't working at Sunset, you know, or Amigo or wherever, you know, and so there's a whole different, you know, set about that, and again, it extends to Wolfgang. I just interviewed Wolfgang here and did the whole thing about, you know, Mammoth 2. I had to remind him about stuff, you know, because I had seen like an interview he'd done with Total Guitar, and he said like, oh yeah, it was just it's getting too late. The SA-126, you know, on the whole record, and the only other guitar I used was the Frankenstein for the solo. And it's like, yeah, but on your Instagram you put their Dirty Movies SG up there. And he's like, oh yeah, that's right. Oh, I used it on this, you know, and I had to kind of remind him about stuff.
Strikes
you know?
again.
You know, and Wolf couldn't tell me what pedals because they were just working fast and furious. Right. You know, I was like, I can't remember, you know, I had my stuff, I had my EVH stuff that I have on my pedal board, but then, you know, Elvis had his own stuff, and it was just, we were just throwing stuff up there. And again, he wasn't concerned about reproducing the stuff live, so he wasn't taking note of what pedals they were using on what tracks and what parts and whatever, because he's just like, I'll just let the other two guys figure that out, you know.
And Don always had said to me too, what I'd ask, he'd be like, oh, it was Ed. You know, it was Ed. Like, you know, I never, it's not a matter of saying, how did he get the sound? But he'd be like, Ed, you know, it's Ed. You know, and that's sort of like answer the questions. It's like, yeah, sure, I did stuff. Sure, I recorded stuff and I did things to make the album sound a certain way, but it's like you're dealing with a guy who's had a ungodly ability to control tone coming out of a guitar amp. You don't need me to do much except like, you know, make sure it's getting on tape and it sounds the way he wants it to sound.
Wow. And I think that's the genius of Ted, you know, with the first record, was not to really try and bend and shape them, you know, which is what Gene did before on the demos and stuff. He tried to fit Van Halen into what worked for Kiss, you know, whereas Ted was like, I saw you guys live and I just want you guys to do what you do, you know, let's not worry too much about overdubs, just set up and ram through this stuff, you know. And I think that was the genius of Ted to do that, because the Doobie Brothers is an entirely different process, you know.
2 drummers, a lot longer, a lot more overdubs, horns, whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
It's kind of simple.
You know, whereas Van Halen was just like, it was almost almost like a punk band, you know. It's just like, get up there and bang it out, be loud, you know. I mean, thank God the time that Van Halen came around was when, you know, recording engineers figured out how to record loud amps, because we have a lot of stuff that was done during the 60s. These guys had to use tiny little amps, you know, to get a loud sound, because the microphones couldn't handle it. And the engineers can figure out how to, you know, get the sound without the mics distorting and everything. So, but I think it's a blessing that, you know, Ted came along and realized that, you know, I mean, just, you know, any other number of producers could have come along to produce Van Halen and they would have messed him up. You know, they would have messed with a good thing. And Ted saw the magic and the purity of the band, you know, and left it at that. So, and I guess the band also saw fit to bring their A game, because, you know, I'm sure that Roth, even though he won't admit it, but I'm sure he felt, you know, because he did go out and get the vocal lessons and everything. And, you know, that period that they had, it's also a blessing that Ted had to work on the Doobie Brothers, you know, after he did the demos, that the band had time to think about what they wanted to do. And they had time to, you know, because just to listen to the progress from those, you know, what was it, March, May, that they did the demos. And then of course, late August, September that they recorded the album in 77. They progressed, the band progressed, you know, you can even hear it in the live performances and everything like that. You know, it's just like, they brought their A game when they finally came time to do their debut record.
And they were all living in Pasadena at the time. So Ted talked about in 1977, before they recorded, how he'd be, working with the Doobie Brothers, and he'd drive home and he'd stop at Dave's house and go down to the basement and listen. And they'd be like, "What about this?" They play this, and then he'd be like, "Huh?" He'd be like, "What if we move this part here?" And he said that Ed was like, unlike anybody else for being modular. Like he'd be like, "Oh, okay, I'll just move this piece of this song, this to this here, and we'll move this here." And and they would just move parts around. Or he said that, and if Ed didn't remember something, he'd be like, "Look at Alex. Alex, you remember, right?" And Alex would say something to Ed, like, like sort of like the brother translation. He'd be like, "Oh yeah," and they would like, something else. But he said that they really would shed it, meaning that those guys practiced, and Ted was kind of checking in with those guys and like listening. And they were, when they went to record that record, I mean, that's why it went so fast, because they were so rehearsed and so ready. And there'd been pre-production without those guys knowing it was pre-production, that he was just stopping by the basement, drinking a couple beers with them, listening to their stuff, and being like, "Okay, we're gonna go let's do this thing in August or whatever."
Yeah, very cool. That reminds me of something about about this guy, about the Western Exterminator guy, because you were talking about them being in Pasadena, and I am certain the reason why this guy became the mascot. If you've been in Hollywood, you know this. You go on the Hollywood freeway, and you go from like Sunset or Hollywood Boulevard or whatever, and you hop on the Hollywood freeway, the road to Pasadena. As you get closer to downtown, they have this big Western Exterminator sign with this guy. I can remember that. And I'm sure that just burned in their memories from so many club gigs of leaving Gazzari's, or the Whiskey or whatever, or even, the Starwood. Every night driving back to Pasadena, there'd be this dude with the hammer,
almost home.
We've got like another 20 minutes to go.
I was talking about documents. It'd be interesting. Someone should go over to Western Exterminator and see if they have I never heard whether they had licensed it. I assume they did license it, the image.
They did license it, yeah.
They did license it. Yeah, I would think so, right? That there's probably like some contract that's got signed with Western Exterminator.
Right.
We will pay you X number of dollars till whatever. But
yeah. Unfortunately, it was a temporary thing, and I think that it expired a long time ago, so they can't really use that anymore, and which is too bad. But
that's my
great.
Yeah, it is great. It is a great logo there. Thank God they didn't use any Sparkomatic crap, right? I'm good. Thank God that got shot down, right?
Well, the other thing, the story about the cover is that they originally wanted to have like 4 like chrome robot women. Was the original concept, which I'm sure was a Dave thing.
Yeah.
And thank God they didn't. Because I guess
the artist Autograph could steal it later.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, that's why, right? That's gotta be why.
Yeah,
gotta be right. You're right.
Yeah,
I never thought of that.
That would have dated it. That would have made it so dated. Because that's such an '80s.
I thought they would have used the Boy Howdy. I always like that Boy Howdy. The beer shirts. I thought they would have used that. That'd been cool.
It's just amazing how everything just worked out as well it did. Go ahead, Greg.
No, I was just going to say it's interesting. In going through old Rolling Stones and stuff, like you see, like, was it Schlitz that sponsored the Who tour in '82? Like it was like a thing, like sort of like we're not going to sell out. All these bands, in the '60s, they're not going to sell out. But then the Doors famously made their stand with "Light My Fire," and they wouldn't let Buick use it or something in like 1970 or something like that. But then it became a thing where it was like very common to have like a perfume company sponsor the Stones '81 tour. I'm almost positive that it did, right?
Like Jovan or something like that.
Yeah, Jovan, right? So like, the fact that they didn't do that, I know in Noel's book, he talks about how that caused friction with Dave or whatever, but it was, it wasn't as if it would have been some massive like violation of code, I guess, so to speak. Because other, like, you said Who did it, the Stones did it. I mean, I don't know. It wasn't like other bands were doing it.
Yeah. The Who kind of thing broke ground with that quite a bit. I mean, it would have made perfect sense for Van Halen to be, to be promoted or whatever, sponsored by
like Budweiser or something, right? I mean, like, yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, I have to say, bring it around to the present day, because Sammy's, tour coming up here, and he's of course got all his liquor brands and his craft beer and all that stuff sponsoring that. Ed, I'm sorry, I know he wants to call it a tribute to Ed, but Ed would have hated that. Ed would have hated all of Sammy's sponsor stuff. He just would have been like, oh, so.
Especially since it broke up the band in the end, right? That was like one of the main reasons, right?
That's in the 2004, that disastrous tour and everything was because Sammy was so much into promoting, Cabo Wabo tequila and whatever, and that
Can I just jump in here? Can I just
Yeah.
jump in here, Chris, and just alert you to something that came to my mind when we did our Christmas show? If Mikey Mojo was in here, he made a great point. He said, look, we've got to remember, guys, that a lot of these bands aren't making money anymore through selling records and Spotify. They're getting nothing.
No.
So one way that they're making money is charging you $400 for a seat to go and watch this gig. So in a way, if corporates can kind of sponsor tours and keep the prices down so that we're not paying $400 for a ticket, hopefully $50, surely that's got to be a good thing.
No, I agree. And I just know with Ed, though, Ed was, again, we talk about this stuff about why there's all these, all the hidden gems in 5150 that aren't coming out. Ed was so old school. Ed and Alex they're very much, they have this whole thing about, whether, Led Zeppelin would do it, or would the Beatles do this, or would the Stones do this, and that was kind of their model. And they were really big into mystery and not exposing the curtain behind the Wizard of Oz, and that sort of stuff, so I think that's, just the sponsorship thing was something they weren't into. I know personally from Ed, could have made 10 times the amount of money that he did, but he turned down so many lucrative offers for this, that, and the other. It goes on. And he would do other things that would mystify you, like sell the Flying V, the 1984 Flying V, and the 2 Les Paul bursts, for a handsome sum of money. But Ed, you could have done something else for that money, I'm still upset that, after we did the Guitar Aficionado thing, that, Matt Bruck and I both wanted to get Ed to do a book on all of his guitars.
Sure. And
I had talked with the powers that be over Genesis Publications, so I did the Clapton book with at that time. And, the 6-string stories, and wanted to do something, brought it up to them. And Ed could have made a lot of money. Those books are not cheap. They'd sell for $500, $600, sometimes $1,000 a copy. And they're a limited thing, but there's enough people out there. And I think that's the type of book that someone would have bought, and then of course, like with 6-string stories, they several years on down the line, they did a regular trade version of it for a much more affordable price. Same thing they did with the Jimmy Page book. But Ed just wasn't into it. Books weren't his thing. I wasn't the only guy trying to get him to do an autobiography, just to be the guy there to scribe it down for him. Rosen tried to do it. Unfortunately, I think Rosen didn't understand the book publishing industry and how it works. So that's why that never came. And of course, it kind of led to, I think, the dissolving of the relationship. But Ed just wasn't really into that type of thing. He wasn't into a book, and there was, again, I had been around him, and there were times like someone would ring up with an offer, manager or whatever, and Ed would just shoot it down right there on the spot. Not interested.
Yeah, and look, Jeff's making some great comments here in the chat too about Page, and we've made reference to that point many times on the show. Jimmy Page is looking after the fans. He's going out there and emptying the vaults, and every time he's coming out with Led Zeppelin 2 as a remastered version, there's other tracks included. And again, I've got to make a point here. Jeff's saying, Page understands legacy. That's a big point in rock and roll.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
And if a band can do that, and or management of a band, not necessarily the band, but maybe the management needs to step up, guys. Greg and Chris, I don't know if you've got an opinion on that. Does the management need to step up and say, look, we're going to curate this legacy. We're going to get the stuff out there.
I don't presume to know for sure, but I suspect that Irving has tried to do things, and I suspect that that's not gotten anywhere for whatever reason. So Irving Azoff is, as we all know, the most successful rock manager in history, most likely, or in the top 5. I presume he's made all sorts of suggestions and probably knows what is going to be a non-starter and what's going to not get anywhere. I don't know that for sure, but that, it isn't as if this person hasn't, got the Eagles back together. I mean, there's things he's accomplished. Obviously, we go down the long list of things going back to the 70s.
Yeah. Ray Daniels, kind of, when, we interviewed him for the book, he talked about the difficulty he had in kind of getting them, like a lot of people like to say, oh, Ray Daniels is the guy who pushed Sharon on them, but that's not the case at all, people can say whatever, but got to remember that Ray Daniels, managed Rush, for years and years and years and years and years and years. And so he's not some hack, or anything. Okay. And he just said that, he kind of walked in the midst of all this turmoil, first of all. So that was part of his big challenge, but he said there was a number of things that it was just like, I couldn't dictate anything to these guys, they, especially Alex was really kind of the buck stops here guy in the band more than anything. He was kind of the guy who's like, this isn't right for us, or this isn't what the type of thing that we want to do, and, I think with Ed being gone, it's probably even, that's closed down even more, because I think there might've been times where Ed, I think, could have talked him into something, but, beyond that, it was just, they're kind of they're almost unmanageable, in their own way. And I know of stuff to this day, the other things that they could be doing, to bring the legacy and to keep it alive, and they don't want to do it. And, I guess bless them in a weird way, because they're comfortable with what they made. They're not like super greedy. They're not like intent on becoming billionaires, or whatever. Alex has got a comfortable lifestyle. I'm sure that he gets nice residual checks, and royalties, on an ongoing basis that keeps him happy and his bills paid and everything. I saw that with Ed. I mean, it was just kind of funny that, I've known people that have made similar amounts of money to Ed. And you it, but Ed was kind of, I think he still was that kid from Pasadena in many ways, that a buck was still a buck, even though he had several million of them in the bank, it still was a buck to him, and he never lost sight of that. He had his extravagances with his cars and everything, but it still was like not. He just, he had the house, there in Coldwater Canyon, and he was content, being there. He could have moved into another place elsewhere, or bought a ton of places. I mean, he basically bought places around there for his family, bought a house for his mom, and everything. Later on, bought a house for Janie, for when after he passed. But he was not really. He built 5150. That's what he put his money into. That was his thing in his cars, and that was really it.
And even 5150 was built at the time as cheaply as possible. I mean, obviously, I know that things got upgraded, but they built it in 1982 with like the cheapest stuff they could find. It would work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's as we talked about earlier, the board from United Western, and everything, and that seemed to be on its last legs, and Don had to rewire the thing, and everything, and. But, Don thought it was a good board, and I forgot what he said. I forgot who had the check. I think Jeff had a copy of the check or something that might have been for the board somewhere. But yeah, it wasn't super high tech expensive, and that was the Van Halen way though.
Yeah, it was like as much used stuff as they could buy, like the EMT plates. That board Don had used in 1971 on another record. He had done a record, and then he had used that exact board. Like, again, that's how old it was, right? As you said. So it was like, this is good. This is still good. We'll use this.
Dutch guys for you. Dutch guys for you, Greg.
I think the actual board's in Toronto now.
Yes,
Dutch guys for you.
Right?
It's
Dutch guys. Yeah, well,
Dutch,
I mean,
yeah.
It was like I know from talking to Don that he said he was very concerned about it, not because he said that he had seen home studios that were money pits, basically, like any kind of his orbit of, being an engineer, like, oh, this person just sank this much money and it still sounds like shit, basically. And he was very concerned about, not doing that to Ed, basically, not being like the guy, like, oh, you're writing the check, so we can just, I have my wish list of stuff. We'll get all this stuff. It was just, this will work. And it sounded incredible, right? I mean, it sounded incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it could do that. I mean, that was the thing. It's, they talked about him laughing at his pedal board, because it was in that first tour, it was just a slab of plywood, and, God bless Rudy, a great guy and everything like that. But he was really just a friend, who fell into this position. He wasn't really a guitar tech, not like Tom Weber or somebody like that, like we know today, But he was just a buddy who could, haul stuff around and could figure out how to set it up. you know, but he wasn't any electrical whiz or anything like that. But it was just kind of their way, you know, but did great stuff with it. I did want to talk about a little bit too. I think people misconstrued, and some people talked about the beginning of Hot for Teacher being, I think they mixed up the story about the Lamborghini on Panama, you know, with the beginning of Hot for Teacher, because Alex plays the Simmons, you know, and it sounds like a dragster or a hot rod warming up, you know, that rhythmic thing going on, but it's Alex on the drums.
Well, that story comes from the TED book. That was where that all started.
Right.
Oh, was it? Okay.
So Ted told me when we listened to it a number of times, he said, I think there's a cut right here. He goes, I think it's the drums. It's the car that goes into the drums. I'm like, are you sure? He goes, I'm pretty sure it's the car that goes into the drums. And he was, you know, was pretty sure about it. You know, you know, obviously, I think if anyone could see the master tapes, you would obviously see it. If it was there on Hot for Teacher, would say Lambro or something, there would be a track. There would be obviously a track of car engine.
Yeah.
But I suspect that in thinking about it, that there probably was at some point, maybe there was an experiment done, or they listened to it and they go, oh, you know, they're listening to the way it was loping. And that was part of what's maybe sparked the idea. You know, so, I mean, a lot of people have kind of come out and said, Ted's not remembering right. And it's, again, I can only tell you that's what Ted told me. And I asked him a number of times, and that's what he recalled it. And maybe there was an early experiment that was done with sort of playing with that. And they sort of like were messing with it. You know, but that's where that story came from.
Yeah,
it seems pretty clear now.
It was Alex. So that's,
right.
I mean, that was many years after the fact, but that's, and
Yeah.
to me, it sounds like, and we've all seen Alex play that stuff.
Correct.
You know, that's the other thing.
Correct.
So we know he's physically capable of doing it.
Correct.
What Alex
You know,
did was the Simmons floor toms. They used kick drum sounds on the Simmons floor tom that he was using.
Right.
They just tuned it differently. So I think that was part of it. And I know Tanner that's on here. It's called a Herta, Herta. I guess that's that rhythm of like an engine rhythm. It actually has a name or whatever like that. And I guess that's what Alex was doing on there. Tanner goes in deeply to it, and he actually can duplicate it with the Simmons sounds. That's cool. Yeah, he's supposed to put a video on YouTube of it, but he actually can pull it out. You can hear it. Pretty cool.
It's very much.
The other thing I thought was interesting, really quick, was that in one of the Rosen interviews that were done, like that Ed and Donna or Ed and Alex are talking about how that this afternoon we had the Lamborghini. We're working on Jump, and we were like revving the engine and whatever they were doing with Jump. This was sort of right around the time of the US Festival. So there was, you know, they were obviously like putting the mic in the car and thinking about what can we do this? What can we use this on the album with? And again, that's why you know, for whatever Ted's memory is inaccurate, I suspect maybe that's what it was. Maybe there was an initial like loping sound that was Alex was doing on the drums, and it was sounding like that. And that's sort of what sparked that. But it's cool that it can be reproduced with the drums, which I never really had a huge stake in either way. I was just going on what Ted recalled. It's sort of that first 2 seconds, like it's like not even that. It's like a second. It's like blub, 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 and then it's sort of it kicks in. But it's interesting.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Is things get mixed up in memory and things like that. And it's you know, it's just like the Lamborghini on Panama gets somehow translated to Hot for Teacher intro. You know, and Ed, again, we talked earlier about Ed. You know, was it the Frankenstein or was it the Kramer 5150? On that, he's told the story both ways, right? You know, and I would run into times where Ed would contradict himself, and it's very frustrating when you're dealing with an artist, you know, who you respect very much, and especially when I had to run things by him for his approval, and you know, I would challenge him up to a point, you know, because there would be a point where he'd get offended and then he'd shut down, right. You know, and people would say like, well, why didn't you talk to him about this? And it's like, yeah, because you know, you don't know the warts and all. With some of these interviews I did with that, sometimes I'm asking him questions like, I don't want to talk about that. And that doesn't look very good in print. When you ask a question and he says, I don't want to talk about it, it makes him look like an asshole, you know? So that would just get cut. So there'd be times I talk about subjects and he didn't want to talk about them. So we wouldn't go there. Right. And I knew if I did try and press him on that, I wouldn't be invited back. You know, that was the other side of it.
Right.
You know,
I mean, you ask someone about their memory, like I said, that, you know, like in that example, I asked Ted numerous times, I'm like, are you sure? And he goes, I'm pretty sure. I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure. You know, and again, like, what are you going to say? Like, we're going to have to, you know, prove it, like, or whatever. You know, it's just sort of, it's a memoir and you have to sort of take it for what it's worth. But at some point, like you said, like it gets, you know, you weren't there. Like, what the, you know, dude, like, you know, I was there, you know, like, and so at some point you're just like, okay, he never got like that. But I just asked him a couple of times, like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah, pretty sure. And I was like, you know, the big scheme of things, it wasn't, you know, Ted has enormous respect for Alex. It wasn't sort of like offense to Alex. It was more like, this was a cool thing that we came up with, playing with them.
And that might have been what led to it. It might have been that they dug that, the engine thing, and then Alex, I can do that on the drums, or maybe they tried recording, it didn't sound cool, and Alex said, like, I'll try it doing it myself. Who knows? Especially with that record in particular, because it was over a rather prolonged period. And again, that's why I think, actually what I got out of it, I was pretty happy with, but it was 30 years after the fact, that we were talking about this stuff, and some things are just going to be wrong. I know there's a few times where we talked about stuff, and sometimes I correct it in the book, and there's times I want to go back and change things, for whatever reason, just because things come to light for whatever reason. After the fact, you write something, and maybe there'll be another revision somewhere down the road or whatever, but these things become immortal. Some of those old interviews become immortal, and sometimes Ed was pulling our leg, or he didn't really remember right, or it's just happened to be something he said. Sometimes it wasn't transcribed properly. I know that happened. I worked at Guitar Player magazine in the early 90s and with Jazz Obrecht and stuff, and just saw how the editing process worked. And that was still, when we had computers and everything. So I can only imagine what it was like in the late 70s and early 80s when he was writing this stuff, and just, stuff gets passed around to other editors and things get changed. I can remember, I don't think this part ended up in print. It might've got cut because I was looking for it just recently. But when I interviewed Jeff Beck in 92, he used this phrase, which, this was back before the internet was what it is today. But he said, it's like chalk and cheese. And that's a common British phrase, chalk and cheese. And none of us were aware at the office there knew. I knew he said chalk and cheese because I had the tape and I talked with him. I was there when he said it. And they were like, this doesn't sound right. Do you think he meant talking cheap? Or did he say this or something? And they went through all these permutations, and I'm just like, fuck it, I'm just cutting this section out, because we can't agree on anything here. But, that's what we had sometimes about some of these things, at least, like Greg and you and I, we're close to the source. So, and when we do these books, we can kind of fix things. Cause I kind of went back and fixed some stuff from Guitar World stuff that got edited. Or some stuff that got,
I'll tell you guys a funny story about that is that, Ted is notorious for, changing the sequence on records, all the Van Halen records, from what I understand, the songs don't match up with what's on the record because Ted would change the sequence up to the very, very last minute. Like there'd be test pressings and they'd be listening. He'd be like, oh, let's change this and, change this around. So there's all these different sequences. And so to finish the book, Ted was like, wanted to make some changes. And it wasn't as if he wanted to like cut a whole bunch of stuff out. He more wanted to add stuff. It was like, he wasn't that he was dissatisfied with what was in there. He was like, in a one famous exchange I had with him, he's like, is that all we're going to say about basically making the VOA record for Sammy? I was like, well, that's what we talked about. It's like a couple of pages of stuff. He's like, we got to put more good stuff in there. So he wanted he felt like we didn't capture how fun it was. And so he wanted to add more stuff in, which is not, when you're going to finish a book, is not ideal when, it's good, but you're like, oh, there's more stuff. I'm like, I wish we would have talked about this 6 months ago. You're like shooting stuff, and it was not ideal. But, the one story that's funny is about Sammy ordered ribs or something like that. And the way Ted's story was, was great. It was about how like upbeat Sammy is and how much he loved working with him because it was always so fun. It was like, Sammy slapping me on the back. I got like barbecue sauce all over my face and my hair. And he's like, oh, this is great, Ted. And he's like, basically it was a great Sammy story, but Ted wanted, he wanted to, like you said, like, add more stuff in or like change stuff. It's not super ideal when you're up against a deadline. You're like, it's like, we're good. I think we're good. No, we're not. We need more. Okay, here we go. Not great, but it was, it worked out okay, but it's
Ed would do that too. It's funny because it's like Ed's one of the few artists that most people I've interviewed over 1,000 different people, and most people you have your time with them and you're done and you move on.
Right.
Ed was a whole different process altogether. As I've mentioned time and time again, I ran stuff by him, and I'll do that with a few people, but most people are like, fine, whatever, they aren't worried about it. But Ed, I think especially once he started working with Roth again, in particular, that became sensitive, and he didn't really want to offend Dave, so anything. So a lot of times it just came to like, if I said anything about Dave, I want to cut it all out, But there'd be a lot of times where he'd call me up after the fact and like, oh, I forgot to talk about this. I forgot to talk about that, you know, and it was really refreshing.
Right. That's cool. Right. That's great. That's the good stuff when you're getting someone to call you and say there's more.
It was close to deadline and it was like, oh God, you know,
why didn't you tell me this 2 weeks ago?
Exactly. It's like, is it really important to you, Ed? You know, because I don't know if I can fit it in there. You know, I do my best, but I only have so much control.
Oh.
I love that story about like when Jeff Beck, like, you know, working on Blow by Blow, and he called up George Martin and he said like, oh, I want to change something on the record, and like George says like, the record's been out for a month. It's like Jeff wasn't even aware his record was out.
Ted told that story about Van Morrison with I can't remember the name of the song. It was the song that one of the first singles that Van and Ted did together, and Don had worked on it to clean it up. They'd remixed it, and Van insisted that the original mix was better, but there was all this leakage on the original. God, I can't remember the name of the song, but anyway, it's in the book. And so he was like, okay, fuck it. Basically, like Don had worked really hard with Ted to sort of make a better mix. But Van was like, absolutely not. We're putting out the original mix. And so it came out. And then Don and Ted, the record's on the radio. They're playing it, but the single's sort of like slipping and it's falling off the charts. And he said that Ted said he was in his office, and Van called up and said, Ted, you were right. Let's put out the other mix. Ted said he wanted to like smash the phone. You know, he was just like, that's exactly what he said. He said, you were right. Let's put out the other mix. Meanwhile, the single's on the radio, and it's you know, Ted thinks it didn't do as well because it didn't sound the way he thought it should sound for whatever. But yeah.
Oh man,
that'll fix it.
That's the thing I love. I mean, you know, as so many of us that are fans, you know, we get so obsessed about stuff, and it's kind of a drag sometimes when you realize that the artists behind the stuff aren't as obsessed as we are.
Yeah, right.
Know? But I can relate. I mean, just, you know, I do recording myself, and there's sometimes where you're working on something and the hours are late and you're not paying attention, and you grab something and you put it down and it's done. And then you wake up the next morning, you completely forgot what you did, you know, or several months on down the line, you don't remember what you did, you know, and it's just, it's frustrating if you want to go back and recreate that. That's the only time I find where it's like, I wish I kept notes on that, especially if you're working with like a synthesizer or something like that. And you got a specific sound and you want to go back and do another take of that track, or you want to punch something in, you can't match the sound anymore. It's like, oh, I wish I saved that, you know?
Yeah.
But,
yeah. And I think it's one of the interesting things too, that we like to think sometimes about some of the shows that we do here, Greg and Greg, you know, in 50 years time, when people are doing research, they want to find out what people were saying in 2023 or 2024 about Van Halen. You know, and in a kind of, you know, weird way, people will be referencing this conversation that you're having today together with us, you know, as a point in reference to future books on Eddie Van Halen. It's a fact, you know, and one of the great things that social media provides is it gives an opportunity for this kind of discussion to happen, so you can start talking about some of these things that might be forgotten. Does it make sense, John?
Total sense. Let's hope 50 years people are talking about Eddie Van Halen. Let's hope.
Well, look, and I wanted to say too, Chris, that just it's, you know, that's the thing. It's like I think about the fact that Ed never did a book. I mean, that's really, it's just because, you know, you guys had that experience with Guitar Aficionado with handing him a guitarist and being like, what about this? And then suddenly the story comes out, you know, like that was the thing, like those objects up there to have that. I guess what I'm trying to say is like, it's really unfortunate a book was never done, but I'm very glad you guys did that with Guitar Aficionado, because that is it was an incredibly unique set of stories and references from Ed that we never, like, you know, I think if you guys hadn't handed him the Les Paul Jr., he probably wouldn't have told the story the same way about the varnish and the paint and all the other stuff. It just was an amazing thing. That was the coolest thing when that came out.
That's why I wish we could have done the full book, you know, because it's like every guitar had a story.
Oh, yeah, of course.
It, you know, and that's the thing. And it's just like, and it's a memory trigger as much as anything,
right?
You know, and it's like that may not come out in a question, or it may not be something we know. I have to thank you for your book for bringing out so many photos that were just sitting in people's drawers somewhere, you know, that you brought people out of the woodwork, and that kind of got the ball rolling on us figuring a lot of this stuff out.
I just, I mean, I appreciate that. I just think for me, it was like, I'm sure you felt the same. You guys, you know, you and Brad felt the same way. It's like, it's a legacy. You know, to me, it's like, obviously we're invested in it. It's not like it's just like, oh, well, I'm just doing a book about this thing I don't care about. It's like, I'm deeply invested in it as care about these stories, care about the past, and you just wanted to appreciate, to preserve it. Like, you know, again, it may not be the only take on Van Halen, or, you know, other people might have other opinions, do other books, but it's like, you want to try to preserve the legacy and tell the stories, and to pay tribute to what these guys did, because it matters to me. I mean, it matters to everyone here.
And I think, Greg, you know, your books certainly provide that. You know, we were talking a little bit about this in the green room, folks. You know, you know, you guys have filled the holes for a lot of us Van Halen fans, and the fact that you two are fans as well, and you're hanging out with fans like us, is a credit to the community that we're in. And you know, that information and that desire and passion that we have to know all the intricate details. And there were a lot of comments during the course of this show where guys are saying, you know, they listen to other bands and other music, and no one's asking the questions that we ask here as fans.
Well, there's an interesting thing about Van Halen that's I think part of it is the mystery behind some of it, but there's also just an emotional connection that you don't get with a lot of other music too. But it's I do find it's fascinating, because I mean, it's the whole decoding the Frankenstein, you know, because Ed, you know, initially around 2006 and 07, he was telling me, oh, I think it was 74, 75, but now we know from the photos it wasn't until early 77 that he had the body. You know, so there's no way we know what he was playing now in 74 and 75, because we have photos, you know, from that, and we can date them now. We can back them up with people's memories or dates they've written on the back of the photo or whatever. You know, just this stuff coming to light, just it fills in the pieces, you know, and Ed doesn't remember that stuff. You know, David Lee Roth sure doesn't remember. You know, I'm sorry. It just, again, there's so many things that happened after Ed died where people came out of the woodwork with these stories, whether it was, you know, Kevin Dugan's story about, you know, the 1984 thing coming from Mike's bass solo, or David trying to take credit for the stripes on Ed's guitar, you know, or stuff. It's just like, guys, you're just, you know, I'm not saying Ed's untouchable, but you're going into subjects that you're not giving him a chance to defend himself, you know, and you're, especially when you're trying to chisel away at the guy, you know, and there's times where that's maybe appropriate, you know, but there's other times where it's just like, you're kind of pissing on his grave, you know, and it pisses me off a bit, especially when we have this documentation, this other stuff, and this other evidence, you know, out there on that. And and again, just knowing how these guys work, you know, I know that Ed, you know, painted that guitar. I'm pretty confident, you know, that he did get the idea from the Dills, from Chip Kinman's Les Paul, because the timing's just too coincidental on that when you just see how things line up. And it's just, you know, I don't think Ed was consciously ripping it off. I just think he saw that and said, oh, that's cool. That inspires me to do this. Right. You know, because
I always thought too, it's like a magician. I didn't really interrupt you, Chris, but it's like a magician. Like, do we like go up to magicians and say, tell me how you learned that trick? Like, you know, it's like you look at the thing and you go, like, that's amazing. You know, I guess it's, I don't know. It's like, wouldn't it be weird if Ed was like, oh yeah, you know, like I think I saw this, whatever, you know, like, again, it's like, right. It's just, you saw this thing, and, you know, I guess what I'm saying is, like, people expect, like, the key.
You got it. Yeah.
Oh, the magic trick.
Magic trick.
Is this me, Wise Magic?
That's pretty cool.
Wise Magic there.
Yeah. Right.
I had a gold and a silver key, and now it's just a single silver key, and it didn't come off the ring.
Yeah. The mystery is what makes it interesting.
Yeah.
Well, look, we certainly appreciate the fact that you guys have jumped on and spent 3 hours just about hanging out with us, Greg and Chris in particular. We had a lot of people watching the show, and we appreciate that for the folks that have been hanging out, the 38 of you that are still here. And if you are watching on a replay, we really ask that you will go and purchase the books. We'll have the links for those books. Yep, there they are. You need at least one copy of each.
At least
They're available on audio as well. So go and get the audio so you can listen to the audio version. But we'll also include Greg's social media links. Greg has an Instagram and a Twitter account, and we'll include that there. Go and follow him. Chris is active on Instagram as well, and he's got a YouTube channel. We'll include that. Go and support them and give them a lot of support for upcoming projects I'm sure that they're going to be working on. Greg, if there's anything that we can do here on our channel for any upcoming projects that you've got that you want to promote, please yell out to John or get in touch with me. We'd love to have you on here to talk about any projects. It's what we can offer with our channel. It doesn't cost anything except for a bit of time, obviously. And the same with you, Chris. If there's anything that we can do for any upcoming projects, let us know. You guys have a permanent invite to join us here on any upcoming show that we have too. If you want to jump on, just give us a yell. We'll make room for you.
Cool. I think we should do a part 2 somewhere, because I mean, I think we just scratched the surface. You know, it's with Greg, you took me off in so many other directions of stuff that I'm still learning. I mean, that's the thing about this. It's still a process, and this is what's
never ending.
So great. It's never ending.
End of January, there'll be a part 2. End of January. Last week in January, there'll be a part 2. Promise.
Cool. Because we, just to get into the individual songs, there's some great stories behind the individual songs and other details. And of course, it was such a fertile period, Fred in particular, of creativity. We talked about the soundtrack work and everything like that. We got off into the Beat It thing, just all leading up. We didn't even talk about the Brian May Starfleet project.
Oh, yeah. All right.
No, well, I'll be back. Chris will be back. Will you be back, Greg?
I'll be back.
Okay,
cool.
Johnny's back, and Les Paul, you'll be back.
I'm back.
Yeah. When does part 2 come out of the of your interview with Don? The
next issue of Tape Op, which I think is end of January.
Nice.
Tape Op, yeah. The first part.
It's a free sub too, people. So sign up now and
I mean, great magazine. Larry's a great guy, and it's just, and he's really been great support to me. So yes, definitely check it out. It's going to be cool, I think.
Yeah, hopefully we'll
send the link to that.
We can talk about it. That'll be great.
Yeah, I will.
Send the link to that, Greg, and I'll attach that here on the description for anybody that's watching on replay that wants to go and follow the interview that Greg is talking about. But we're going to go around quickly, so I'm going to say thank you, folks. Happy New Year for hanging out with us. For all our friends in the chat, we're not going to go through and do a shout-out to you, but you all know that you're important to us. Thanks for subscribing. All subs get a subscribe back, and go and please check out Chris and Greg's links and support them. Johnny.
Everybody go listen to our favorite album, my favorite album of all time, 1984. Celebrate the 40th anniversary of this masterpiece, and crank it up. Piss off the neighbors.
Awesome. Les Paul, have you got something to say quickly?
Yeah. I can't wait to get my 1971 Super Lead back modded with a master volume. So I can't wait to crank it up in a few weeks.
So you don't piss off the neighbors because it has a master volume, right?
It will wake up the neighbors. Yeah.
All right.
Chris, I do have to put in a plug for the was it the UA FX? What is their Plexi thing called? I'm trying to remember the name of it. The Lion. Yeah. I got that just recently to review. It's getting late, so I'm starting to lose my memory. But that sounds great. It's just if you want a Plexi inexpensive and to record with, or to even to play live and for a fly rig or whatever, it's a really cool box. It's got the magic.
I'll check it out. And Greg, you've got the last word.
Thank you, guys. It's a real pleasure. Chris, it's been real enjoyable. Really great conversation. And it's been 3 hours. It does not seem like 3 hours. So more to come.
Cool.
Awesome. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate you guys. Thank you.
See ya.
Thanks, Greg. Woo.